The plateau is cold at this hour, well before dawn, and the wind coming off the desert is not the dry, sand-carrying wind of summer, but something heavier, carrying moisture from the northwest. The figure standing at the edge of the limestone outcrop is not thinking about permanence. He is thinking about the shape already inside the rock. He has been here many times. The rock has been here far longer than anyone in his world can calculate or name. It rises from the plateau in a rough mass, pale and fractured along its upper edges where the rains of the previous season left their mark. Down the flanks of the outcrop, in the lower courses of the stone, the water has worked itself into the surface in a way that's unmistakable to anyone who has lived through enough wet seasons. Broad, rounded channels, deep undulations, the smooth interior curves of water that fell for a long time, in large quantities, over many generations. Not wind, not sand, water. He places one hand flat against the stone. The surface is cold and damp. Beneath his palm, the rock gives nothing away about when it started being shaped, or by whom. He only knows that the outline of what stands here, the haunches, the head, the forward gaze, was already present in the natural stone before the first tool touched it. His people found it, and they followed what was there. Far to the east, the sky is beginning to separate into layers. The lowest layer, just above the horizon, carries a faint orange edge. Higher up, the darkness holds. And in the sky directly before him, low and precise, the constellation he was told to watch for hangs at the horizon in exact alignment with where the sun will rise. His teachers called this alignment the beginning. Not the beginning of the year, the beginning of everything, the moment when the sky repeats itself from the very start. The Sphinx of Giza is one of the most recognized structures on the surface of the Earth. Almost everyone who has seen a photograph of it knows its approximate shape. The recumbent lion's body, the human head, the forward gaze directed east. What most people do not know, and what 6 specific pieces of evidence make increasingly difficult to dismiss, is that the monument may be far older than the civilization that Egypt's ancient records claim built it. The conventional date given for the construction of the Sphinx is roughly 4,500 years ago, placing it in the reign of the pharaoh Khafre during the 4th dynasty of the Old Kingdom. That date comes primarily from proximity and association. The Sphinx sits near Khafre's pyramid, and a small diorite statue of Khafre was found near the site. No inscription anywhere on the Sphinx itself names a builder. No text carved into its body says when it was made. The date is an inference, and it is an inference that a growing body of evidence is placing under significant strain. This is a documentary for sleep and background listening. The topic is ancient, the evidence is real, the pace is steady. You are in the right place. Stay until the end, because the 6th piece of evidence is the one that changes the shape of everything that came before it. The limestone first. That is where the case begins, and it is where it is strongest. The Giza Plateau is composed of several distinct types of limestone, and the Sphinx is carved directly from the bedrock of the plateau, rather than assembled from cut blocks like the pyramids nearby. The monument's body, the lion's torso, the sides, the front paws, sits within a large rectangular enclosure that was cut away from the surrounding plateau, at the same time the Sphinx was shaped. This enclosure is known as the Sphinx Ditch, or the Sphinx Enclosure, and its walls are the most important surfaces for understanding when the monument was carved. Those walls are deeply weathered. Not at the top where younger stone and later repairs sit, but in the lower and older courses. The weathering pattern is vertical. Long, rounded channels running from top to bottom, with undulating surfaces and deep, wave-like profiles. The profile of erosion in stone depends on what caused it. Wind erosion, which is what you would expect from thousands of years of desert exposure, produces horizontal scarring. The wind moves horizontally, carrying sand at a certain height, and it cuts the stone at that height, creating horizontal bands and pockets. It does not produce long vertical channels. Vertical channels with rounded profiles cutting deeply into the interior of the stone are the signature of heavy rainfall runoff over a sustained period of time. The water falls, it runs down the vertical face, it concentrates in natural weaknesses in the stone, and it carves. Over decades, this produces the shallow beginnings of channels. Over centuries, the channels deepen and widen. Over millennia, they become the broad, rounded, wave-like undulations that a geologist looks at and identifies immediately as precipitation-induced weathering. The critical geological question for the Sphinx, then, is a simple one. when did it last rain heavily and consistently enough, and for long enough, to produce that pattern of weathering on the walls of the enclosure? The answer to that question, drawn from the paleoclimatic record of northeastern Africa, is not comfortable for the conventional chronology. The last period of sustained heavy rainfall in the Giza region, the kind of rainfall capable of producing deep, rounded, vertical weathering in limestone, ended approximately 6,000 to 7,000 years before the present. This is not a contested figure. The African humid period, sometimes called the Green Sahara, was a climatological interval during which the Saharan and sub-Saharan regions received dramatically higher precipitation than they do today, driven by a shift in the orbital parameters of the Earth that intensified monsoon activity. During that period, what is now hyper-arid desert supported grassland, lakes, rivers and woodland. It ended as the orbital parameters shifted back, around 5000 BCE, give or take several centuries depending on local geography. If the weathering on the Sphinx enclosure walls was produced by that rainfall, the Sphinx predates the end of that wet period. That means the Sphinx was already standing, already carved into the plateau, at least 7,000 years ago, and possibly considerably earlier, given that significant weathering requires not just the presence of rain, but the accumulation of rainfall over a substantial period. A geologist named Robert Schoch, associated with Boston University, examined the Sphinx enclosure walls in the early 1990s and published his conclusions in professional geological literature. His assessment, stated plainly, was that the weathering pattern on the walls of the Sphinx enclosure was consistent with precipitation-induced weathering from a period of heavy and sustained rainfall and was inconsistent with wind and sand erosion. He proposed a revised date for the core body of the Sphinx, somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 years before the present, with the possibility of an even earlier origin for the initial carving. The Egyptological establishment rejected this interpretation, largely on the grounds that there was no known civilization in the Nile Valley or on the Giza Plateau at that time capable of carving a monument of that scale and sophistication. This is a reasonable objection, but it is worth noting that it is not a geological counter-argument. It is an argument from absence. We don't know of a civilization that could have done it, therefore it wasn't done then. The geology, standing on its own, points elsewhere. That is the first piece of evidence, and it is the most technically grounded of the six. The second piece of evidence emerges from the same limestone, but from a different direction. The question of repair. The Sphinx has been repaired multiple times across recorded history. Egyptian records document at least two major phases of restoration. One during the reign of Thutmose IV, in the 14th century BCE, roughly 1200 years after the supposed date of original construction, and one during the Ptolemaic period several centuries later still. The Thutmose IV restoration is documented by the Dream Stele, a carved granite tablet placed between the Sphinx's front paws by Thutmose IV after he claimed the god Horemakhet appeared to him in a dream and promised him the throne of Egypt in exchange for clearing the sand from the Sphinx's body and restoring the monument. The Sphinx was already buried to the neck in sand at that point. What is interesting for our purposes is not the fact of the restorations themselves, but the extent and depth of the limestone casing blocks that were used to repair the lower body of the Sphinx. These repair blocks are massive. Some of them are several meters in height and thickness, and they encircle the lower portions of the monument's body, particularly the sides and haunches. They were added not for decorative reasons, but because the original limestone of the body was so severely degraded that it could no longer hold its form without structural support. The degree of degradation in the original limestone core, under the repair blocks, is extreme. Not just weathered, but deeply and extensively eroded, in patterns that are consistent with long-term precipitation weathering rather than wind erosion. This degradation is what necessitated the scale of the repairs. If the Sphinx had been carved 4,500 years ago and had been in an arid, desert environment for most of its subsequent existence, the degree of weathering observed in the core limestone would be difficult to account for through wind and sand alone, even over that span. Geological studies of limestone in comparable desert environments suggest that wind erosion operates at a significantly slower rate than precipitation erosion on vertical limestone faces. The depth of the weathering observed in the Sphinx enclosure walls, the lower, older courses especially, implies either an extraordinarily long duration of exposure or exposure to a more erosive agent than wind. The pattern says water. The The climatology says the water was present in sufficient quantities before 5000 BCE. The implication is that the Sphinx was old enough to have been extensively weathered before the rain stopped. By the time the first pharaoh of the Old Kingdom took the throne, the Sphinx may already have been ancient. The seismic evidence, which forms the third piece of what we are examining, comes from a different kind of scientific instrument entirely. In the early 1990s, a team of researchers conducted seismic surveys of the bedrock beneath the Sphinx and its immediate enclosure. Seismic surveying works by measuring the way sound waves, generated by controlled vibrations at the surface, travel through underground rock and reflect back. Different types of rock and cavities within rock return different signatures. The technique is standard in geology, civil engineering, and petroleum exploration, and the data it produces are not ambiguous in the way that visual inspection of stone surfaces can be. The surveys beneath the Sphinx enclosure detected anomalies. Specifically, they detected zones in the bedrock directly beneath the Sphinx and along the floor of the enclosure where the seismic signature was consistent with cavities or chambers, areas where the rock is less dense, where there are voids. These anomalies are distributed in a pattern that is not random. They appear to cluster beneath specific portions of the monument, particularly beneath the pores and along the sides of the enclosure. The existence of cavities beneath the Sphinx is not itself evidence of age. Natural limestone is riddled with voids of geological origin. What makes the seismic anomalies notable in this context is their combination with the weathering evidence and with a separate tradition, preserved in Egyptian texts of the late period, that refers to something beneath the Sphinx. The texts are fragmentary and their interpretation is genuinely contested, but several of them describe a place called the Inventory Stele, or reference a chamber associated with the Lion Monument at Giza. The seismic anomalies, on their own, prove nothing about the age of the Sphinx, but they are a piece of the picture, and the picture they contribute to, taken together with the weathering evidence and the repair evidence, is one of a monument whose origins may reach back significantly further than 4,500 years. The sun has cleared the horizon now. The plateau is fully lit, the limestone pale and sharp-edged in the early light. The figure who stood at the edge of the rock before dawn has withdrawn, back into whatever world he came from, back into the deep time before the first pharaoh, before the first hieroglyph, before the first record that any Egyptian scribe ever set down in stone or clay or papyrus. But the rock remains, the channels in its surface remain. The water that carved them has been gone for thousands of years, but the stone holds the shape of it, patient and indifferent, waiting for someone to read it correctly. The remaining three pieces of evidence shift the focus from the physical stone to the sky above it, to the texts that surround it, and to the one fragment of Egyptian record that most directly contradicts the conventional account of when the Sphinx was built. Those three pieces are what the next section of this documentary will examine in detail. The sky above the Giza Plateau does not change. That is the essential point. The stars move in their long cycles, the constellations rise and set, the planets wander across the ecliptic, and all of it follows a clockwork so precise that modern astronomers can run it backward with confidence for tens of thousands of years. You can ask a computer program where any star was on any night in the past, and the answer will be accurate to within a fraction of a degree. This precision is what makes the fourth piece of evidence both testable and striking. The fourth piece of evidence concerns the astronomical alignment of the Sphinx and the broader layout of the Giza Plateau, and it begins with the direction the Sphinx faces. The Sphinx faces due east, with a slight northward deflection that has been measured at approximately 1 degree. This orientation is consistent across all major scholarly surveys of the monument, and it is not an accident of the terrain or of the construction process. The Sphinx was deliberately oriented to face the rising sun, a fact consistent with its identification across multiple periods of Egyptian history as a solar deity, as a guardian of the horizon, and as the god Horemheket, Horus of the horizon. The solar alignment is not in dispute. What is in dispute is which solar event the Sphinx was originally oriented to observe. At the spring equinox today, the sun rises due east, and the Sphinx's gaze falls upon it. This alignment is used by some researchers to argue for a 4th dynasty construction date, because the equinoctial alignment would have been valid in Khafra's time just as it is today. The argument has merit, but there is another alignment that requires the precision of celestial mechanics to evaluate, and it points to a different date entirely. In the study of precession, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis that causes the apparent position of the stars against the background of the sky to shift over a cycle of approximately 26,000 years. One of its most visible effects is the movement of the constellations along the eastern horizon at dawn. The constellation that rises due east at dawn on the spring equinox changes over the course of the precessional cycle. Today, the Sun rises at the spring equinox against the background of the constellation Pisces, which is why we are said to be leaving the age of Pisces. Before that, the background constellation was Aries, before that, Taurus, and before Taurus, going further back, it was Leo. The age of Leo, the precessional period during which the constellation Leo rose due east at dawn on the spring equinox, lasted from approximately 10,900 BCE to approximately 8,700 BCE, give or take the imprecision of where one draws the boundary of a constellation. The Sphinx in its original form was a lion, not the human-headed lion it appears to be today, with the heavily reworked head that many researchers have noted is disproportionately small for the body. In its original conception, the argument goes, the Sphinx was a recumbent lion facing east, toward the horizon, positioned to gaze at its own celestial counterpart, Leo, rising on the spring equinox dawn. If that is correct, the Sphinx was built to commemorate or to mark the age of Leo, placing its construction somewhere between 10,900 and 8,700 years before the present. The middle of that range is roughly 10,000 BCE. This is the astronomical argument, and it was developed most fully by the writer and researcher Robert Bauval, working in collaboration with Graham Hancock, and presented in the 1990s. The argument draws on astronomical software to reconstruct the sky above Giza at various dates in the deep past, and to identify the moment when the celestial arrangement best matches the ground plan of the Giza Plateau. Bauval's broader thesis, the Orion correlation theory, proposes that the three pyramids of Giza were laid out to mirror the three belt stars of the constellation Orion as they appeared in the sky around 10,500 BCE, when Orion reached its lowest point in the precessional cycle and the belt stars were closest to the southern horizon. The Orion correlation itself is contested. Critics have pointed out that the match between the pyramids and the belt stars, while visually compelling, is not geometrically precise, and that the offset of the smallest of the three pyramids from the line of the other two matches the belt star Mintaka at multiple different precessional dates, not just at 10,500 BCE. These are legitimate objections and they deserve to be stated plainly. The astronomical argument for the Sphinx's age is more constrained and more specific than the Orion correlation. It rests on the direction the Sphinx faces, the identity of the monument as a lion, and the period during which the constellation Leo rose due east at the spring equinox. The question of the Sphinx's original head is not a minor detail. It bears directly on the astronomical argument and on the broader question of age, and it constitutes a piece of evidence that is distinct from the astronomy itself. The Sphinx's head is by any standard measurement too small for its body. A natural lion, in an anatomical proportion, has a head that represents a substantial fraction of its total body mass. The head of the Sphinx measured against the body is roughly 1/3 of what the proportions of the body would suggest. This disproportion is visible to the naked eye and has been commented on by visitors, architects and researchers for centuries. The standard explanation is that the head was recarved. The original head, which would have been a lion's head, in anatomical proportion with the lion's body, was later reworked into a human face, and in the process of recutting the stone, a significant volume of material was removed, reducing the overall dimensions of the head to their current undersized state. This is not an eccentric hypothesis. It is the most straightforward explanation for an obvious anatomical anomaly in a stone carving otherwise executed with considerable skill. If the head was recarved, the question becomes, when and whose face does it now carry? The face is conventionally identified as Khafra's, but the identification rests primarily on stylistic comparison with the diorite statue of Khafra, found near the Valley Temple associated with the Sphinx. A forensic facial analysis conducted by the New York City Police Department in the 1990s, at the request of a documentary team, concluded that the proportions and features of the Sphinx's face were not a match for the proportions and features of the Khafra statue. This analysis was conducted blind, without the examiner being told which faces were being compared. The conclusion was that the Sphinx's face does not belong to Khafra. This does not establish who the face does belong to. It only removes one of the primary arguments used to assign the monument to the 4th dynasty. The recarved head, the undersized proportions, the lion's body oriented toward the rising Leo. These details form a coherent picture when taken together. The original monument was a lion. At some point during the historical period, when the memory of the original purpose may already have faded, the head was reworked into human form by a pharaoh who wished to claim the monument as his own. This kind of appropriation was standard practice in ancient Egypt. Later rulers routinely had the inscriptions and images of earlier rulers removed and replaced with their own. The result was a monument that preserved the ancient body. The lion's haunches, the great paws stretched forward, the powerful hindquarters, but wore a human face whose proportions never quite fit, because the face was cut from a head that had been designed for a different purpose. The inventory stele adds a different kind of evidence to the sequence. This carved limestone tablet was found in the 19th century in the precincts of Giza and is held today in the collection of the Cairo Museum. Its text records a building project carried out by the pharaoh Khufu, the builder of the Great Pyramid, who ruled approximately a generation before Khafra. And in the course of describing that project, it refers to the Sphinx as already existing at the time of Khufu's reign. The text calls the monument by a name that translates roughly as the Sphinx of Horemakhet, and it describes Khufu ordering repairs to the Sphinx rather than its construction. If the inventory stele is accurate in this detail, then the Sphinx predates Khufu, which means it also predates Khafre. It cannot have been built by Khafre if it was already standing and in need of repair during the reign of Khufu, his predecessor. The Egyptological response to the inventory stele has been to question the reliability of the document itself. The stele is dated by its hieroglyphic style to the late period, the 1st millennium BCE, which is several hundred years after the events it purports to describe. It is therefore classified by many Egyptologists as a pious fiction, a text composed in the late period that projected backward into the Old Kingdom, either as a forgery designed to establish the antiquity of Giza's monuments, or as a tradition recorded at a much later date whose historical accuracy cannot be verified. This is a reasonable position to take. Late copies of ancient records are not automatically reliable. The Egyptian tradition of recopying older texts and of retroactively attributing actions to legendary rulers is well documented, and the inventory stele may indeed be an example of that tradition, rather than a faithful record of Old Kingdom events. But it is worth noting what the inventory stele does and does not say in this context. It says the Sphinx existed before Khufu. It does not say how old the Sphinx was at the time of Khufu's reign. Even if the stele is a genuine late-period composition based on actual Old Kingdom records now lost, the most it can tell us is that the Sphinx was understood, at some point in Egyptian memory, to have preceded the construction of the Great Pyramid. That understanding, if it reflects any historical reality at all, is significant. The broader Egyptian textual tradition preserves, in fragmentary and indirect form, references to a prior age. The Papyrus of Turin, a hieratic manuscript dating to the reign of Ramesses II in the 13th century BCE, contains a section known as the King List, in which the reigns of historical pharaohs are preceded by a list of divine rulers and semi-divine figures, the Shemsu Hor or followers of Horus, whose collective reign is assigned a duration of several thousand years before the first pharaoh. The total duration assigned to the Shemsu Hor in the Turin King List is approximately 36,300 years, though the numbers are fragmentary and contested. No one working within the mainstream of Egyptology treats the divine reigns listed in the Turin Papyrus as literal historical records. They are understood as mythological or legitimizing narrative, a way of grounding the authority of historical pharaohs in a divine past. But the existence of the tradition is notable in itself. Egyptian culture preserved a deep memory of a prior age, a time before the pharaohs, during which gods and semi-divine figures ruled the land. Whether that memory reflects actual historical events, actual human beings, actual structures, actual knowledge, or whether it is purely mythological cannot be determined from the texts alone. What it establishes, alongside the geological and astronomical evidence, is a consistent pattern. Multiple independent lines of evidence, the weathering of the enclosure walls, the repair blocks and their implications, the seismic anomalies, the astronomical orientation toward Leo, the forensic analysis of the face, the inventory steles testimony, and the broader Egyptian textual tradition of a prior age all point in the same direction. Not toward the reign of Khafra, not toward 4,500 years ago, but toward something older, something that sits at the edge of recorded human history or beyond it. The plateau holds all of this quietly. The Sphinx faces east, as it has faced east for as long as anyone can establish, through the long centuries when it was buried to the shoulders in sand, through the clearing and the repairs and the tourists and the floodlights. The stone does not offer an opinion on when it was carved. It simply endures, carrying the marks of the water that fell on it long ago, wearing a face that may not be the one it started with, watching the sun rise at the spring equinox in an alignment that grows more precise the further back in time you go. The fifth piece of evidence deals with what the plateau itself looked like before the sand reclaimed it, and with what the water found when it ran down the sides of the enclosure and pooled at the base of the walls. That evidence comes from a combination of soil analysis and paleoclimatic reconstruction, and it fills in the picture of the wet period in a way that makes the geological argument for an early date considerably harder to dismiss. The plateau is silent in the hour before dawn, and the wind carries no sand. It carries moisture instead. The heavy dampness of a world where rain falls regularly and the desert has not yet claimed this place. The figure standing beside the great carved lion moves quietly along its flank, one hand trailing against the limestone surface. The stone is cool and slightly wet with condensation. Above him, the body of the monument rises in smooth curves, the haunches powerful and perfectly proportioned, the head unmistakably feline, gazing eastward toward the horizon where the stars are beginning to fade. He has come here on this particular morning because his teachers told him to watch the sky. In the east, low and brilliant, the constellation of the Lion hangs at the precise point where the sun will rise. This alignment happens once each year, but this year is different. This year marks the completion of something vast, a cycle that began long before his grandfather's grandfather was born. The lion in the sky and the lion carved from the plateau stone face each other in perfect symmetry, and the moment of their meeting marks the center of the age that bears their name. The carving behind him is ancient even by the measure of his people. No one alive remembers who first saw the shape within the rock and began to free it. The work has continued across generations, each group of carvers following the natural form that was already present in the limestone outcrop, gradually revealing what the stone itself seemed to suggest. Now it is finished, or nearly so. The great paws stretch forward into the enclosure that has been cut away from the surrounding bedrock. The body curves in the unmistakable posture of a lion at rest, alert, watching. The face looks east with an expression that is neither hostile nor welcoming, simply present, witnessing each dawn as it has witnessed them for longer than anyone can count. In the growing light, he can see the marks on the enclosure walls where the seasonal rains have run down the limestone, carving shallow channels that grow deeper each year. The rains here are not gentle. When they come in torrents that transform the landscape for months at a time, turning the surrounding valleys into lakes and marshes, bringing game animals down from the highlands and supporting the scattered communities that live by hunting and gathering, and the careful cultivation of wild grains in the richest soils. The sun clears the horizon. The constellation of the lion fades into daylight. The carved lion continues its eternal watch, and the man beside it turns away toward the settlements to the east, where the cooking fires are already beginning to send smoke into the morning air. Welcome to a documentary for sleep, a steady journey through evidence that challenges what we think we know about one of the most famous monuments in the world. This is the kind of story that unfolds slowly, in pieces, each detail adding weight to a picture that grows more compelling the longer you look at it. The pace is calm, the facts are real, and there are 6 specific pieces of evidence to examine, each one more difficult to explain away than the last. The Sphinx of Giza stands on a limestone plateau approximately 8 miles southwest of modern Cairo, Egypt. It measures roughly 73 meters long and 20 meters high, making it the largest monolithic statue carved from a single piece of bedrock anywhere on Earth. Its body is that of a recumbent lion, its head appears human, and its gaze is directed due east toward the rising sun. These are the basic facts, and they are not in dispute. What is in dispute is when the Sphinx was carved, who carved it, and why. The conventional answer, taught in universities and repeated in virtually every guidebook to Egypt, is that the monument was created during the 4th dynasty of the Old Kingdom, approximately 4,500 years ago, during the reign of the pharaoh Khafra. This date comes not from any inscription on the Sphinx itself, which bears no identifying text, but from circumstantial evidence. Its proximity to Khafra's pyramid complex, the discovery of a diorite statue of Khafra in the nearby Valley Temple, and the general assumption that the great monuments of Giza were all part of a coordinated building program during the Old Kingdom. That assumption, however, faces 6 pieces of evidence that are increasingly difficult to reconcile with a 4th dynasty construction date. These pieces of evidence come from geology, from astronomy, from forensic analysis, from seismic surveys, from ancient Egyptian texts, and from the physical characteristics of the monument itself. Each piece stands on its own. Taken together, they point toward a conclusion that would rewrite the timeline of human civilization. The Sphinx may be far older than Egypt itself. The first piece of evidence is geological, and it begins with water. The Sphinx sits within a large rectangular enclosure that was carved from the bedrock at the same time the monument was shaped. This enclosure, roughly 100 meters long and 50 meters wide, forms a courtyard around the base of the Sphinx, with walls that rise directly from the limestone plateau. These walls are the key to understanding when the monument was created, because they preserve a record of the climate that existed after the carving was completed. The walls of the Sphinx enclosure show extensive weathering, but not the kind of weathering you would expect from thousands of years in a desert environment. Wind erosion in arid climates produces horizontal scarring, because wind-blown sand moves parallel to the ground and cuts stone in horizontal bands. What the enclosure walls show instead is vertical erosion. Deep, rounded channels running from top to bottom, with undulating surfaces and wave-like profiles that are unmistakably the result of water runoff. This pattern of erosion requires sustained, heavy rainfall over long periods of time. Water falls on the walls, concentrates in natural weaknesses in the stone, and gradually carves vertical channels. Over centuries of consistent precipitation, these channels deepen and broaden until they produce the extensive weathering visible on the Sphinx enclosure walls today. The problem with this evidence is the climate. The Giza Plateau today receives less than 25 millimeters of rainfall per year, barely enough to sustain desert scrub vegetation. This hyper-arid climate has persisted in the region for approximately 4,500 years, which means that if the Sphinx were carved during the reign of Khafre, as conventional chronology suggests, it would have experienced little precipitation erosion during its entire subsequent history. Wind and sand would have been the primary erosive agents, and they would have produced horizontal, not vertical, weathering patterns. The last period of sustained heavy rainfall in northeastern Africa ended between 6,000 and 7,000 years ago, during the transition out of what climatologists call the African humid period, or the Holocene climate optimum. During this interval, which lasted from approximately 11,000 to 5,000 years before present, the Saharan region received monsoon rains that supported grassland, woodland, lakes, and rivers across what is now extreme desert. The transition out of this wet period was gradual but definitive, driven by changes in the Earth's orbital parameters that shifted monsoon patterns southward. If the weathering on the Sphinx enclosure walls was produced during the African humid period, then the Sphinx was already carved and standing when that wet climate ended. This places the construction of the monument at least 6,000 to 7,000 years ago, and possibly much earlier, depending on how long the weathering process required. Dr. Robert Schoch, a geologist at Boston University, conducted detailed examinations of the Sphinx enclosure in the early 1990s and published his findings in peer-reviewed geological journals. His conclusion was straightforward. The weathering patterns on the walls were consistent with precipitation-induced erosion and inconsistent with wind erosion. He proposed a construction date for the Sphinx of between 7,000 and 9,000 years ago, with the possibility of an even earlier origin. The geological evidence for water erosion extends beyond the enclosure walls to the body of the Sphinx itself. The monument shows signs of extensive repair work using limestone blocks that differ in composition and weathering characteristics from the original bedrock. These repair blocks, some of them several meters in height and thickness, were added to the lower portions of the Sphinx's body during documented restoration projects, the earliest of which dates to the 14th century BCE during the reign of Thutmose IV. The fact that such extensive repairs were necessary suggests that the original limestone had already undergone severe weathering, by the time of the first recorded restoration, approximately 1,000 years after the supposed date of construction during Khafra's reign. If the monument had been carved during the 4th dynasty and had existed in a consistently arid environment for the following millennium, the degree of weathering requiring such massive structural repairs would be difficult to explain through wind erosion alone. The repair work documented during the reign of Thutmose IV was not cosmetic. The dream stele, erected by Thutmose IV between the front paws of the Sphinx, describes the monument as being buried in sand up to its shoulders and in a state of serious deterioration. The limestone casing blocks added during this restoration were substantial structural repairs designed to prevent further collapse of the original bedrock core. Geological analysis of limestone weathering rates in comparable climates suggests that the level of deterioration requiring such extensive repairs would be consistent with either an extremely long exposure to wind erosion or a shorter exposure to precipitation erosion, followed by wind erosion. The precipitation erosion hypothesis fits the observed weathering patterns more closely and provides a more plausible timeline for the degree of deterioration documented by the time of the Thutmose IV restoration. The second piece of evidence is seismic, and it reveals what lies beneath the plateau. In 1991, a team of researchers conducted ground-penetrating seismic surveys of the bedrock beneath and around the Sphinx. Seismic surveying uses controlled sound waves to map underground structures by measuring how the waves reflect off different materials. Dense rock returns one signature, loose soil another, and cavities or chambers produce distinct anomalies that can be mapped with considerable precision. The surveys detected multiple anomalies beneath the Sphinx enclosure, areas where the seismic signature suggested the presence of voids or chambers in the bedrock. These anomalies were not random but appeared to cluster beneath specific areas of the monument, particularly beneath the front paws and along the northern and southern walls of the enclosure. The existence of subsurface chambers or voids does not necessarily indicate artificial construction. Natural limestone formations frequently contain caves, solution chambers, and other geological voids. However, the pattern and location of the seismic anomalies beneath the Sphinx are consistent with the possibility of constructed chambers, and they align with references in ancient Egyptian texts, chambers or passages associated with the Sphinx. The seismic evidence becomes more significant when considered alongside other indications of underground features at Giza. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in the 1980s and 1990s detected what appeared to be corridors or chambers beneath the Giza plateau, some of them running between the major monuments. These surveys were conducted by multiple independent teams using different technologies, and while their results have not been conclusively verified through excavation, they consistently suggest the presence of subsurface features that may be artificial rather than natural. Ancient Egyptian texts from various periods make reference to chambers, passages, or halls of records associated with the Sphinx and the Giza complex. These references are fragmentary, and their interpretation is contested, but they include mentions of underground repositories of knowledge, hidden chambers containing records of ancient wisdom, and passages connecting different parts of the Giza complex. While these textual references cannot be taken as literal architectural descriptions, their consistency across different periods suggests that some tradition of underground features at Giza persisted in Egyptian cultural memory. The combination of seismic anomalies, radar detections, and textual references does not prove the existence of constructed chambers beneath the Sphinx, but it establishes the possibility and provides a direction for future investigation. If such chambers exist and contain artifacts or inscriptions that could be reliably dated, they might provide direct evidence for the age of the Sphinx and the civilization that built it. The third piece of evidence comes from astronomy, and it requires looking not at the ground but at the sky above the Giza plateau as it appeared thousands of years ago. The Sphinx faces due east with extraordinary precision, aligned to within less than 1 degree of true east. This orientation is clearly intentional and has been maintained throughout all documented restoration projects. The eastward orientation aligns the monument with the rising sun, consistent with its identification in Egyptian texts as a solar deity and guardian of the eastern horizon. Today, the sun rises due east at the Sphinx on the spring and autumn equinoxes, creating a perfect alignment between the monument and the solar disk twice each year. This alignment would have been equally valid 4,500 years ago during the supposed reign of Khafra. which is often cited as evidence supporting the conventional construction date. However, there is another celestial alignment that points to a different date entirely. The precision of astronomical calculations allows us to determine not just where the Sun was on any given date in the past, but also which constellation formed the background of the sunrise at the spring equinox. This background constellation changes slowly over a cycle of approximately 26,000 years due to the precession of Earth's axis, a slow wobble that causes the apparent position of the stars to shift against the seasons. Today the Sun rises at the spring equinox against the background of the constellation Pisces. 2,000 years ago, it rose against Aries. 4,000 years ago against Taurus. And between approximately 10,900 and 8,700 years ago, the constellation that formed the background of the equinoctial sunrise was Leo the Lion. If the Sphinx was originally conceived as a lion monument facing east to observe the rising sun, then its most astronomically significant alignment would have occurred during the age of Leo, when a stone lion on the ground would have gazed at its celestial counterpart rising with the sun at the spring equinox. This alignment would have marked the monument as a herald or celebration of the precessional age that bore the same symbolic identity as the monument itself. The astronomical argument for an early date for the Sphinx was developed most comprehensively by Robert Bauval and Graham Hancock in the 1990s. Their calculations, verified using modern astronomical software, demonstrate that the optimal celestial alignment between the ground-based lion and the constellation Leo occurred around 10,500 BCE, placing the monument's construction in the middle of the age of Leo. This astronomical evidence is independent of the geological evidence for water erosion, but it points to a similar time frame. Both lines of evidence suggest a construction date between 7,000 and 11,000 years ago, well before the conventional chronology of Egyptian civilization. The astronomical alignment argument gains additional support from the broader layout of the Giza complex. The three pyramids of Giza are positioned in a pattern that closely matches the arrangement of the three belt stars of the constellation Orion as they appeared in the sky around 10,500 BCE. This correlation, known as the Orion correlation theory, suggests that the entire Giza complex may have been designed as an earthbound mirror of specific stellar configurations that were significant during the age of Leo. While the Orion correlation has been challenged on grounds of geometric precision, the Leo alignment of the Sphinx is more constrained and less subject to measurement uncertainties. The Sphinx faces east. It was originally a lion, and the constellation Leo rose due east at the spring equinox during a clearly defined period in the astronomical past. The correlation is specific, testable, and points to a date that aligns closely with the geological evidence for the end of the African humid period. The fourth piece of evidence is anatomical, and it concerns the question of whether the Sphinx head we see today is the same head that was carved when the monument was first created. The head of the Sphinx is disproportionately small for its body. Measured against the scale of the lion's torso, neck and limbs, the head represents approximately 1/3 of what natural anatomical proportions would suggest. This disproportion is visible to casual observation and has been noted by visitors, architects and researchers for centuries. Natural lions have large heads relative to their body size, with powerful neck muscles and pronounced facial features that reflect their role as apex predators. The head of the Sphinx, while skillfully carved, lacks the scale and proportion that would be expected for a monument otherwise executed with remarkable attention to naturalistic detail. The most straightforward explanation for this anatomical anomaly is that the head was recarved. The original head would have been proportional to the body, a lion's head of appropriate size and character. At some point after the original carving, the head was reworked into human form, and in the process of reshaping the stone, a significant volume of material was removed, resulting in the current undersized proportions. This explanation is not speculative. Recarving and appropriation of monuments was standard practice throughout ancient Egyptian history. Later rulers routinely modified the inscriptions, images, and identifying features of monuments built by their predecessors, either to claim credit for existing structures or to eliminate the memory of previous rulers. The practice was so common that Egyptologists have developed detailed techniques for identifying recarved inscriptions and modified sculptures. If the Sphinx head was recarved, then the face we see today may not belong to the pharaoh who originally commissioned the monument. The face is conventionally identified as that of Khafra. based primarily on stylistic comparison with a diorite statue of Khafra found in the Valley Temple near the Sphinx. However, this identification has never been definitively established, and it rests on subjective assessments of facial similarity rather than precise measurement. In the 1990s, a forensic facial analysis was conducted by Detective Frank Domingo of the New York Police Department at the request of a documentary production team. Domingo, who specializes in facial identification and reconstruction, was asked to compare the facial proportions and features of the Sphinx with those of the Khafra statue without being told the identities of either sculpture. His conclusion was that the two faces showed significant differences in proportion and structure and could not represent the same individual. This forensic analysis does not establish whose face the Sphinx actually bears, but it removes one of the primary arguments for attributing the monument to Khafre. If the Sphinx face is not Khafre's, then the association between the Sphinx and the 4th dynasty becomes considerably weaker. The recarved head theory explains both the anatomical disproportion and the weak facial identification. It suggests that the Sphinx originally stood as a fully proportioned lion, consistent with its astronomical alignment during the Age of Leo, and was later modified by a pharaoh who wished to associate himself with the already ancient monument. This modification preserved the powerful body of the original lion while adding a human face, whose proportions never quite matched the scale of the monument as a whole. The 5th piece of evidence is textual, and it comes from an ancient Egyptian document that directly contradicts the conventional chronology of the Sphinx's construction. The inventory stele is a carved limestone tablet discovered in the 19th century near the Great Pyramid and currently held in the collection of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. The text on the stele records building activities carried out by the pharaoh Khufu, who ruled during the 4th dynasty and was the builder of the Great Pyramid. Khufu preceded Khafra by approximately 1 generation, making him an earlier rather than later figure in the conventional chronology of Giza construction. According to the text of the inventory stele, Khufu ordered the construction of certain buildings and the restoration of others that already existed on the Giza plateau when he came to power. Among the monuments mentioned as already existing during Khufu's reign is the Sphinx, which the stele refers to by a name that translates approximately as the Sphinx of Horemakhet, or the Sphinx of Horus of the Horizon. If the inventory stele is historically accurate, then the Sphinx predates both Khufu and his successor Khafra, and it cannot have been built during the 4th dynasty as conventional chronology claims. The monument would instead be considerably older, predating the earliest phases of pyramid construction at Giza. The Egyptological response to the inventory stele has generally been to question its reliability as a historical source. The stele is dated by its hieroglyphic style and content to the late period of Egyptian history, roughly the 1st millennium BCE, which places it more than 2,000 years after the events it describes. It is therefore classified by many scholars as a retrospective composition rather than a contemporary record, either a pious fiction designed to enhance the antiquity of Giza's monuments, or a late copy of earlier records whose accuracy cannot be verified. This skepticism is methodologically sound. Ancient texts that claim to record events from the distant past are not automatically reliable, and the Egyptian tradition included examples of pseudepigraphic works that attributed actions to legendary rulers of earlier periods. The inventory stele could indeed be an example of this tradition rather than an authentic 4th dynasty record. However, the dismissal of the inventory stele based solely on its late date may be premature. Egyptian scribes routinely copied and recopied important texts across many centuries, and the survival of information from earlier periods in later manuscripts is well documented. The fact that the inventory stele was composed during the late period does not necessarily invalidate its content, particularly if it preserves traditions or records that originated during the Old Kingdom. More significantly, the inventory stele does not stand alone as evidence for the pre-4th dynasty existence of the Sphinx. The geological evidence for water erosion, the astronomical evidence for construction during the Age of Leo, and the anatomical evidence for a recarved head all point toward a similar conclusion through completely independent methodologies. The inventory stele, even if it cannot be accepted as definitive historical evidence, provides textual support for a chronology that is suggested by multiple other lines of investigation. The broader Egyptian textual tradition also preserves references to a period of divine or semi-divine rulers who preceded the historical pharaohs. The Turin King list and other sources describe the Shemsu Hor, or followers of Horus, whose collective reign is said to have lasted many thousands of years before the first dynasties. While these references are generally interpreted as mythological rather than historical, they suggest that Egyptian culture preserved some memory of a pre-dynastic period, during which significant achievements in monument construction and knowledge preservation may have occurred. The sixth and final piece of evidence is the most recent and potentially the most significant. It comes from advanced ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in the early 21st century, and from the analysis of electromagnetic anomalies that suggest the presence of large voids or chambers within the body of the Sphinx itself. In 2008, a Japanese team from Waseda University conducted the most comprehensive electromagnetic survey of the Sphinx ever attempted, using ground-penetrating radar technology far more advanced than what had been available in previous decades. They mapped the internal structure of the monument with unprecedented precision. The results were striking. The surveys detected what appeared to be rectangular voids within the body of the Sphinx, particularly in the area of the front paws and extending into the chest region. These electromagnetic anomalies are not small. The largest detected void measures approximately 9 meters in length and appears to be positioned horizontally within the monument's body, roughly at the level where the chest meets the base. Additional smaller anomalies were detected in patterns that suggest they may be connected chambers or corridors, rather than isolated geological features. The Japanese team was careful to distinguish between natural limestone voids and anomalies that might indicate artificial chambers. Natural caves and solution features in limestone typically follow the bedding planes and joint patterns of the rock formation, creating irregular shapes that reflect the geological structure. The voids detected within the Sphinx show geometric regularity that is more consistent with constructed spaces than with natural geological processes. The electromagnetic evidence gains additional significance when considered alongside historical accounts of chambers within or beneath the Sphinx. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, made reference to chambers associated with the Sphinx, though his account is brief and lacks specific details. Medieval Arabic historians, including al-Makrizi in the 15th century, recorded traditions of hidden chambers within the monument, some of which were said to contain records or artifacts from earlier civilizations. These historical references cannot be verified independently, but their persistence across different cultures and time periods suggests that knowledge of internal chambers may have been preserved in local traditions long after any direct access to such chambers was lost. The electromagnetic surveys provide the first objective evidence that such chambers may actually exist. The dawn is different here. Not brighter or darker than the dawns she remembers from the settlements farther up the river, but heavier somehow, weighted with moisture that clings to everything and makes the stone surfaces slippery underfoot. She moves carefully along the base of the great carved figure, one hand trailing against the limestone to steady herself as she follows the channels that the night's rain has cut into the enclosure floor. The water is still running. Not the flash flood that came down from the higher ground during the storm, but the steady seepage that continues for hours after the rain stops, emerging from cracks in the bedrock and pooling in the low places where the stoneworkers carved away the softer layers to reach the harder limestone beneath. Her people have been working this site for longer than the oldest grandmother can remember, following the natural shape that was already present in the rock, gradually bringing out the form that the stone itself seemed to suggest. She understands her role in this work. The carvers and stoneworkers shape the monument itself, freeing the lion's body from the surrounding limestone with bronze tools and wooden wedges, and the patient application of fire and water to split the rock along its natural planes. Her responsibility is different. She tends to the place where the water collects, keeping the channels clear so that the seasonal floods do not undermine the foundation of the carved figure, and she watches for changes in the stone that might indicate weakness or instability in the structure they are creating. The work is slow, each generation adds to what the previous generation accomplished, and each generation trains the next in the techniques that have been developed through countless cycles of trial and refinement. The bronze tools they use are traded from settlements many days' travel to the east, where people have learned to work copper and tin in ways that produce metal harder than anything that can be made from stone or wood alone. The knowledge of how to split limestone along its grain comes from generations of quarrying smaller stones for building foundations and grinding platforms. The understanding of how to work with the natural contours of the rock face comes from centuries of observing how water and weather affect different types of stone. But the vision of what they are creating comes from something older than any of these practical techniques. The figure emerging from the stone is not an invention of her people. It is something they found, something that was already present in the outline of the limestone outcrop when their ancestors first saw this place and recognized what it could become. They are not imposing their own design on the rock. They are revealing what was already there, following the form that the stone itself has suggested across the long generations of work. The water has pooled in the area where the front paws will extend when the carving is complete. She kneels beside the pool and uses a carved wooden scoop to redirect the flow toward the drainage channels that have been cut into the enclosure floor. The work is routine, but it requires attention. If water is allowed to stand against the base of the monument for too long, it will begin to work its way into the natural joints in the limestone, and over time this can weaken the foundation of the entire structure. As she works, she can hear the sound of bronze tools against stone from the area where the carvers are shaping the hindquarters of the lion's body. The rhythm is steady and deliberate. The sharp tap of metal against stone, followed by the scraping sound of debris being cleared away, then the tap again as the tool finds its next target. This is the sound that has echoed across the plateau for more seasons than anyone alive can count, and it will continue long after she is gone, as the work passes to the next generation, and then to the generation after that. The monument they are creating will outlast them all. That is the understanding that guides the work. The individual carvers and water tenders and tool makers will live and die, but the great carved figure will remain, watching the eastern horizon through cycles of wet and dry, through whatever changes may come to the land and the people who inhabit it. The lion in the stone will endure. The implications of internal chambers within the Sphinx extend beyond archaeological curiosity. If such chambers exist and contain artifacts, inscriptions, or other materials that can be reliably dated, they could provide direct evidence for the age of the monument and the technological capabilities of whoever built it. More significantly, they could potentially resolve the contradiction between the conventional chronology and the geological evidence for water erosion. The electromagnetic surveys also detected anomalies that appear to extend beyond the body of the Sphinx itself. Some of these signatures suggest the presence of corridors or passages running beneath the enclosure floor, potentially connecting the internal chambers of the monument with other features of the Giza complex. If verified, such connections would indicate that the Sphinx was not built as an isolated monument, but as part of a larger architectural plan that included subsurface elements. The technology used in the most recent surveys is sophisticated enough to distinguish between different types of voids and to map their three-dimensional structure with considerable precision. Ground-penetrating radar works by transmitting electromagnetic pulses into the ground and measuring the time it takes for the pulses to reflect back from subsurface features. Different materials, solid rock, loose soil, air-filled cavities, water-filled cavities, each produce characteristic reflection patterns that can be analysed to determine their composition and geometry. The Japanese team's surveys were conducted using multiple frequencies and scanning angles to build a comprehensive picture of the Sphinx's internal structure. The consistency of the anomalies across different scanning parameters increases the confidence that they represent real physical features rather than instrumental artifacts or data processing errors. However, electromagnetic surveys cannot definitively determine whether detected voids are natural or artificial, and they cannot provide information about the contents of such voids. Verification would require physical access through drilling or excavation, which has not been attempted due to concerns about damaging the monument and restrictions imposed by Egyptian antiquities authorities. The question of internal chambers connects to broader patterns in ancient Egyptian monument construction. Many pyramids and temples contain internal chambers, corridors, and passages that were integral to their original design. The Great Pyramid contains multiple internal chambers connected by narrow passages, some of which remained hidden until they were rediscovered by modern explorers. The Temple of the Sphinx itself, located immediately adjacent to the monument, contains chambers and corridors cut into the bedrock. If the Sphinx contains internal chambers, it would not be unprecedented in the context of ancient Egyptian architecture. What would be significant is the relationship between such chambers and the age of the monument. Chambers constructed as part of the original design would necessarily date to the same period as the monument itself, providing a potential means of establishing the construction date through dating of any artifacts or organic materials they might contain. The broader geological context of the Giza Plateau provides additional perspective on the question of age. The limestone from which the Sphinx is carved belongs to the Macadam Formation, a geological unit that was deposited during the Middle Eocene period approximately 35 to 40 million years ago. The formation consists of multiple layers with different characteristics. Harder, more resistant layers alternate with softer layers that weather and erode more readily. The Sphinx is carved primarily from one of the softer limestone layers, which explains why it has required extensive restoration throughout recorded history. The softer limestone is easier to carve but more susceptible to weathering, creating a trade-off between workability during construction and durability over time. This choice of material suggests that the builders prioritize the ability to execute complex carving over long-term weather resistance. The pattern of weathering on the Sphinx body reflects the characteristics of the limestone from which it is carved. The softer layers have eroded more extensively, creating the undulating surface texture visible on much of the monument's body. The harder layers have resisted erosion better and stand out as ridges and protective bands that interrupt the smooth contours of the carved surfaces. Understanding the geological characteristics of the Macadam Formation limestone is crucial for interpreting the weathering evidence. Different limestone compositions respond differently to precipitation and wind erosion, and the specific characteristics of the Giza limestone affect the rate and pattern of weathering under different climatic conditions. Studies of Macadam Formation limestone at other sites in Egypt show that this particular rock type is especially susceptible to precipitation-induced weathering. When exposed to regular rainfall, the limestone develops the characteristic vertical channel patterns seen on the Sphinx enclosure walls much more rapidly than it develops horizontal scarring under wind erosion. This geological understanding strengthens the interpretation that the weathering patterns on the Sphinx reflect a period of sustained rainfall rather than prolonged exposure to desert conditions. The rain has stopped, but the air still carries the metallic scent of wet stone and the richer smell of earth that has absorbed more water than it can hold. The figure working in the shadow of the monument's flank moves systematically along the base of the carved wall, checking each of the drainage channels that have been cut into the enclosure floor to direct water away from the foundation. This is skilled work, requiring an understanding of how water moves through limestone and how different surface treatments affect the flow patterns. The channels themselves are carved features, cut into the bedrock with the same bronze tools used to shape the monument itself, following natural joints and fractures in the stone where possible to minimize the effort required, and to work with the structural characteristics of the rock rather than against them. The person performing this work is not young. The grey in her hair and the confident efficiency of her movements speak to decades of experience with this particular site and its particular challenges. She has tended these drainage systems through countless wet seasons, gradually refining their design as she learned more about how the water behaved under different conditions. The knowledge she carries will be passed to younger workers who will, in turn, modify and improve the systems based on their own observations and experience. The monument rising above her has changed significantly during her lifetime. When she first came to this place as a child accompanying her mother, the carving was less advanced. The broad outline was present. The general shape of the lion's body, the orientation toward the east, the scale that would make the finished monument visible from great distances across the plateau. But the details were rougher, the surfaces less refined, the proportions not yet perfected. She has watched the carvers work their way gradually along the length of the body, smoothing surfaces that were previously rough, defining muscles and anatomical details that were previously only suggested, adjusting proportions as they learned more about how the completed sections looked from different angles and distances. The work has been continuous throughout her adult life, with teams of carvers working in rotation to maintain progress without exhausting the available workforce or depleting the supply of bronze tools faster than they could be replaced through trade. The head of the monument has been a particular focus during recent seasons. The original conception called for a lion's head proportional to the body, but the carvers have discovered that the limestone in that area contains inclusions and fractures that make detailed carving more difficult than anticipated. They have had to modify their approach, working around weak points in the stone and adjusting the design to accommodate the realities of the material they are working with. The result is a head that captures the essential character of what they intended, the alert, watchful expression of a lion surveying its territory, but with proportions and details that reflect the constraints imposed by the stone itself. This is the nature of carving from living rock. The final result emerges from a collaboration between the vision of the carvers and the characteristics of the stone, with neither partner in the collaboration having complete control over the outcome. The astronomical significance of the monument is not lost on her or on any of the workers involved in its creation. They time their work to coordinate with celestial events, beginning intensive carving periods at moments when the constellation of the Lion reaches specific positions in the pre-dawn sky. The alignment is not accidental. The monument is being created to mark and celebrate a particular relationship between the earth and the sky, a relationship that their teachers have explained reaches back to the beginning of time and will extend forward to its end. When the carving is complete, the stone lion will face its celestial counterpart at the moment of the spring sunrise, creating a connection between the work of human hands and the eternal patterns of the heavens. This connection will persist long after the current generation of workers has been forgotten, serving as a permanent marker of the age in which this particular alignment was most perfectly expressed. She finishes checking the drainage channels and moves toward the area where the toolmakers are preparing bronze implements for the next day's work. The bronze arrives as rough ingots traded from settlements far to the east, and it must be heated, hammered, shaped, and sharpened before it can be used effectively against the limestone. The tools wear down quickly under the demands of stone carving, requiring constant maintenance and frequent replacement. The sound of bronze being worked echoes across the enclosure, the ring of hammer against anvil, the scraping of files against rough metal, the hiss of hot bronze being quenched in water. These sounds blend with the more distant sounds of stone carving to create the acoustic signature of the site, a complex rhythm that varies throughout the day as different teams begin and end their work periods. The work will continue tomorrow and the day after that, and for many seasons to come. But progress is visible. The monument that was barely outlined in stone when her grandmother's generation began the work now shows clear definition in its major features. The body has the unmistakable proportions of a lion at rest. The head gazes eastward with an expression that captures something essential about alertness and patience and enduring strength. The front paws extend into the enclosure in a gesture that is both protective and welcoming. When the work is finished, when the last details have been refined and the drainage systems have been perfected, and the monument stands complete under the sky, it will serve its intended purpose, to mark the connection between this place and this time and the eternal patterns that govern the movement of the stars. The people who carved it will be gone, but the monument will remain, facing east, watching for the return of the celestial lion that gave it meaning and purpose. The connection between the astronomical and geological evidence creates a convergence that is difficult to dismiss. Both lines of evidence point toward a construction date during the age of Leo, roughly 10,000 to 11,000 years ago, which coincides with the latter part of the African humid period when sustained rainfall could have produced the weathering patterns observed on the enclosure walls. This convergence is significant because the two types of evidence are completely independent. The astronomical calculations depend only on the orientation of the monument and the well-established mechanics of celestial motion. The geological evidence depends only on the weathering patterns in the limestone and the well-documented climate history of northeastern Africa. Neither type of evidence relies on the other, yet both point toward the same general time frame for the monument's construction. The forensic evidence regarding the recarved head adds another layer of support for an early construction date, followed by later modification. If the Sphinx was originally carved as a lion during the age of Leo, and was later modified by a pharaoh seeking to associate himself with the ancient monument, this would explain both the astronomical significance of the original design and the historical associations that led to the conventional chronology. The textual evidence from the inventory stele, while not definitive on its own, provides additional support for a chronology in which the Sphinx predates the major pyramid building period at Giza. Even if the stele cannot be accepted as a reliable contemporary record, its testimony aligns with the pattern suggested by the geological, astronomical, and forensic evidence. The electromagnetic evidence represents only the most recent layer of investigation into what may lie beneath and within the Sphinx. The history of attempts to explore the monument's subsurface features extends back more than a century, with varying degrees of scientific rigor and official authorization. One of the earliest systematic attempts to investigate subsurface features at Giza was undertaken by the French engineer Émile Barrès in the early 20th century. Working under the auspices of the Egyptian Department of Antiquities, Barrés conducted extensive excavations around the Sphinx between 1925 and 1936, clearing sand from the enclosure and exposing the monument's body for the first time in centuries. During this work, Barrés discovered several shafts and passages cut into the bedrock around the Sphinx, some of which appeared to be ancient while others were clearly more recent. Barrés's most significant discovery was a shaft approximately 25 meters deep, located near the rear haunch of the Sphinx. The shaft was carefully cut into the limestone bedrock with smooth, vertical walls and showed signs of deliberate construction rather than natural formation. At the bottom of the shaft, Barrés found a small chamber that had been sealed with limestone blocks. The chamber was empty when opened, but its construction suggested it had been designed to contain something of value. The Barrés shaft, as it came to be known, was documented and then resealed. Egyptian authorities determined that further investigation would require extensive excavation that might destabilize the monument, and the shaft was filled and covered. Its existence, however, established that subsurface construction around the Sphinx was not merely theoretical but demonstrably real. Subsequent investigations using non-invasive techniques have detected additional subsurface anomalies. In the 1970s, a joint American-Egyptian team used resistivity surveying to map the electrical conductivity of the bedrock around the Sphinx. Areas with different moisture content or material composition show different electrical resistance, allowing underground features to be mapped without excavation. The resistivity surveys detected several anomalies consistent with voids or chambers, including some that appeared to be larger than the Barrés shaft. The pattern that emerges from decades of subsurface investigation is one of extensive modification to the bedrock around and beneath the Sphinx. The monument does not simply sit on the surface of the plateau, it appears to be integrated with a complex of subsurface features that may include chambers, passages, and shafts whose original purpose remains unclear. This subsurface complexity adds another dimension to the question of the monument's age. If the Sphinx was part of a larger architectural complex that included significant underground elements, the scale and sophistication of the overall project would have been considerably greater than what is visible on the surface. Such a project would have required advanced planning, skilled engineering, and substantial organizational capacity, capabilities that the conventional chronology attributes to the Fourth Dynasty, but that the geological evidence suggests may have existed much earlier. The morning light reveals details that were invisible in the pre-dawn darkness. The carved surfaces of the monument show the marks of countless bronze tools, the parallel grooves left by chisels working along the grain of the stone, the smoother areas where abrasive stones have been used to refine the surface texture, the subtle variations in depth that create the illusion of musculature beneath the stone skin. The figure examining these details is not one of the carvers. Her role is different, more specialized. She reads stone the way others read the movements of game animals or the patterns of weather in the sky. The limestone speaks to her of stresses and weaknesses, of how the rock will respond to continued carving, of whether natural joints and bedding planes lie beneath the surface. Her guidance determines where the carvers can work boldly and where they must proceed with caution. This morning she is particularly focused on the area where the monument's neck meets its shoulders. The limestone here is more fractured than in other areas, with natural joints running at angles that could cause problems if the carving proceeds without careful planning. The carvers want to define the muscles of the neck more clearly, to give the head a more powerful connection to the body, but the stone itself imposes limits on what can be safely accomplished. She runs her fingers along one of the natural joints, feeling how it extends into the rock. The joint is stable for now, but continued removal of stone from around it could weaken its support and lead to fracturing that would compromise the entire head of the monument. Better to work with the joint than against it, to incorporate it into the design rather than try to eliminate it. This is the kind of knowledge that cannot be taught directly. It comes from years of working with stone, of observing how different types of limestone respond to different techniques, of learning to anticipate problems before they develop. Each type of rock has its own characteristics, its own strengths and vulnerabilities, and successful carving requires an intimate understanding of these properties. The limestone of this plateau is particularly complex. The softer layers carve easily but weather quickly. The harder layers resist both carving and weathering, but can be brittle under certain conditions. The natural joints and bedding planes create lines of weakness that must be respected during carving, but that can also be exploited to remove large sections of unwanted stone efficiently. Understanding these characteristics has allowed the carvers to work with remarkable efficiency, given the scale of their project. Rather than fighting against the natural structure of the stone, they have learned to read its patterns and to shape their techniques accordingly. The result is a monument that emerges naturally from the bedrock, as if the lion had always been present in the stone, and the carvers had simply removed the excess material that concealed it. The work is not without its setbacks. Sections that seemed sound during initial carving have sometimes developed fractures as surrounding material was removed. Areas where the limestone appeared uniform have revealed hidden weaknesses that forced changes to the planned design. Each challenge has required adaptation, modification of technique, and sometimes acceptance that the original vision must be altered to accommodate the realities of the material. But these setbacks have also led to innovations. Techniques for stabilizing fractured stone have been developed and refined. Methods for working around natural joints have been perfected. Understanding of how to read the subtle signs that indicate the internal structure of limestone has deepened with each season of work. The knowledge gained from this project extends beyond the monument itself. The techniques being developed here will be applied to future stoneworking projects throughout the region. The understanding of limestone characteristics will inform decisions about quarrying and construction for generations to come. The monument serves not only as a marker of astronomical significance, but as a training ground for skills that will benefit the broader community. She moves to a different section of the carving, where recent work has exposed an area of limestone that shows unusual coloration. The stone here has a reddish tint that suggests the presence of iron oxides, minerals that can affect both the workability of the stone and its long-term stability. This kind of variation is common in limestone formations, but each occurrence requires individual assessment to determine its implications for the carving process. The reddish coloration could indicate either harder or softer stone than the surrounding material, depending on the specific minerals present and how they have affected the limestone matrix. Only testing with actual carving tools will reveal whether this area will require modified techniques or whether it can be worked using standard approaches. This uncertainty is part of what makes large-scale stone carving both challenging and rewarding. Each section of rock presents its own puzzles, its own demands for adaptation and innovation. The carvers must be both artists and engineers, capable of executing a grand design while remaining flexible enough to accommodate the unexpected characteristics they encounter in the stone itself. The work continues around her, the steady rhythm of bronze against limestone that has become the signature sound of this place. But beneath that rhythm she hears something else, the subtle sounds that stone makes when it is under stress, the barely audible creaks and sighs that indicate how the removal of material is affecting the structural balance of the monument. These sounds are important. They provide early warning of potential problems, allowing adjustments to be made before fractures develop or sections become unstable. Learning to hear and interpret these sounds is one of the most crucial skills for anyone involved in large-scale stone carving, and it is a skill that can only be developed through direct, patient experience with living rock. The monument grows larger and more refined with each passing season, but it also grows more complex in its demands for careful management. As more material is removed and the remaining stone carries increasing structural loads, the margin for error decreases. What could be approached boldly in the early stages of carving now requires careful consideration and gradual progress. This evolution in the demands of the work reflects the monument's transition from rough outline to finished sculpture. The broad strokes that established its general form have given way to detailed work that must balance artistic vision with structural reality. The result will be a monument that appears effortless in its execution, but that actually represents countless decisions about how to work with and around the inherent characteristics of the limestone from which it is carved. The question of what civilization could have undertaken such a project during the period indicated by the geological and astronomical evidence leads to some of the most challenging aspects of the Sphinx chronology problem. Conventional archaeology places the development of complex monument-building civilizations in Egypt at roughly 5,000 years ago, well after the end of the African humid period and the age of Leo. However, archaeological understanding of pre-dynastic Egypt has undergone significant revision in recent decades as new sites have been discovered and new dating techniques have been applied to existing finds. evidence for sophisticated cultural development in the Nile Valley now extends back much further than was previously recognized. The site of Nabta Playa, located in the western desert of Egypt approximately 800 kilometers southwest of the Sphinx, provides evidence for complex social organization and astronomical knowledge dating to approximately 11,000 years ago. Nabta Playa was a seasonal lake during the African humid period, and the area around it was occupied by people who constructed stone circles, alignments, and other megalithic structures that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of astronomical cycles. The megalithic structures at Nabta Playa include stone circles that appear to be aligned with the rising of specific stars, including Sirius, which played a central role in later Egyptian astronomical and religious systems. The precision of these alignments suggests that the people who built them possessed detailed knowledge of celestial mechanics and the ability to undertake complex construction projects, requiring coordination of substantial numbers of workers. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials associated with the Nabta Playa structures indicates that the site was actively used for monument construction between approximately 11,000 and 9,000 years ago, precisely during the period when the geological and astronomical evidence suggests the Sphinx may have been built. The existence of sophisticated monument-building cultures in the region during this time frame establishes that the technological and organizational capabilities required for Sphinx construction were present in northeastern Africa at the relevant time. The Nabta Playa evidence is particularly significant because it demonstrates not just the capacity for large-scale construction, but also the astronomical knowledge that would have been necessary to design and orient a monument like the Sphinx. The stellar alignments at Nabta Playa show that the people who built those structures understood precession and were capable of tracking the long-term movements of constellations, exactly the kind of knowledge required to design a monument intended to mark the age of Leo. Archaeological evidence from other sites in northeastern Africa during the early Holocene period supports the picture of relatively sophisticated cultures existing during the wet period following the end of the last glaciation. Sites in Sudan, Ethiopia, and Egypt have yielded evidence for organized settlements, long-distance trade networks, advanced tool technologies, and artistic traditions that demonstrate considerable cultural complexity. The Qadan culture, which existed along the Nile Valley between approximately 15,000 and 11,000 years ago, shows evidence for systematic exploitation of wild grains, sophisticated tool manufacture, and burial practices that suggest complex social organization. While the Qadan people were not monument builders on the scale implied by the Sphinx, they demonstrate that the Nile Valley supported organized societies with advanced technologies well before the conventional date for the rise of Egyptian civilization. The Halfan culture, which succeeded the Qadan in the same region, shows evidence for even greater technological sophistication, including advanced lithic technologies and what appear to be early experiments in plant domestication. Sites associated with the Halfan culture have yielded evidence for structures that may represent early attempts at permanent architecture, though nothing approaching the scale of the Sphinx. The pattern that emerges from this archaeological evidence is one of gradual cultural development in northeastern Africa throughout the period following the last glaciation. Rather than appearing suddenly during the early dynastic period, the capabilities required for monument construction appear to have developed gradually over several millennia, reaching levels of sophistication that could potentially have supported Sphinx-scale projects by the end of the wet period. The transition from the wet period to the current arid climate of the Saharan region may have triggered significant cultural changes that disrupted or displaced the populations responsible for early monument construction. As the monsoon pattern shifted and the Sahara began to desiccate, populations would have been forced to migrate or adapt to increasingly challenging environmental conditions. The Nile Valley itself became a refuge during this transition, concentrating populations that had previously been dispersed across a much larger region. This concentration may have led to rapid cultural development and the emergence of the complex societies that eventually became dynastic Egypt. However, knowledge and traditions from the earlier wet period may have been preserved and incorporated into the developing Egyptian cultural system. This scenario suggests a model of cultural continuity rather than sudden emergence for Egyptian civilization. The sophisticated astronomical knowledge, architectural techniques, and organizational capabilities demonstrated in later Egyptian monuments may have had their roots in earlier traditions developed during the wet period, traditions that were preserved and refined rather than invented anew during the dynastic period. The Sphinx in this context could represent a bridge between the earlier wet period cultures and the later dynastic civilization. Built during the final phases of the wet period by people with sophisticated astronomical knowledge and monument building capabilities, it could have been preserved and incorporated into the developing Egyptian cultural system as the climate changed and populations concentrated along the Nile. The evidence for early monument building capabilities in northeastern Africa, combined with the geological evidence for water erosion and the astronomical evidence for construction during the Age of Leo, creates a coherent picture that challenges the conventional chronology while remaining consistent with the broader archaeological record of cultural development in the region. The sun has climbed high enough now to illuminate the full expanse of the enclosure. The carved figure casts sharp shadows that reveal details invisible in the softer light of dawn. The subtle modelling of the haunches, the careful definition of the front paws, the way the carvers have used the natural bedding planes of the limestone to enhance rather than fight against the anatomical structure they are creating. The scale of the achievement is becoming evident. What began as a rough outline in the living rock has been transformed into something that captures not just the physical appearance of a lion, but something essential about the character of such an animal. The alert watchfulness, the contained power, the sense of patient strength that can explode into action when circumstances require it. The head, despite the constraints imposed by the fractured limestone in that area, has achieved an expression that manages to be both specific and universal. It is clearly a lion's face, with the broad skull and powerful jaw characteristic of the species, but it also conveys something more abstract, a quality of attention that seems to engage directly with whatever it looks upon. The eastward orientation ensures that this engagement is primarily with the rising sun and the constellations that appear in that quarter of the sky. But the positioning of the head and the angle of the gaze create the impression that the monument is aware of everything that moves across the plateau, that it serves as a guardian and witness to all the activities that take place within its field of view. This dual function, as astronomical marker and as guardian presence, reflects sophisticated thinking about the role that monuments can play in organising both physical and conceptual space. The carved lion marks a specific place on the plateau and a specific moment in celestial time, but it also creates a focal point that gives meaning and structure to the surrounding landscape. The work to create this effect has required not just technical skill in stone carving, but also careful consideration of sight lines, proportions, and the relationship between the monument and its setting. The carvers have had to think like both artists and surveyors, ensuring that their creation will function effectively from multiple viewpoints and under varying lighting conditions. The result succeeds on both levels. As a work of sculpture, the monument captures the essential character of its subject, with remarkable fidelity to natural forms. As a landscape marker, it creates a strong visual anchor that can be seen from great distances and that organises the surrounding space around its presence. The integration of these functions represents a level of sophistication that extends beyond mere technical competence to genuine mastery of the relationship between art, architecture, and landscape design. The people who planned and executed this project understood not just how to carve stone, but how to create a monument that would function effectively as both artistic expression and practical instrument for organising space and time. The carved drainage channels around the base of the monument demonstrate the same integration of practical and aesthetic considerations. The channels are necessary to protect the foundation of the carving from water damage, but they have been designed and executed with the same attention to proportion and visual harmony that characterises the monument itself. Function and beauty are not in conflict here, but work together to create a unified design. This integration reflects a cultural approach to monument building that treats practical requirements not as obstacles to artistic expression, but as opportunities to demonstrate mastery of the relationship between human intention and natural forces. The monument succeeds not by ignoring the characteristics of stone and water and weather, but by working with these forces in ways that turn practical necessities into aesthetic opportunities. The seasonal rains that necessitated the drainage system also provide the water that makes large-scale stone carving possible in this location. Without reliable access to water for softening the limestone, cooling the bronze tools, and washing away debris, the scale of this project would be impossible to maintain. The wet climate that creates challenges also provides solutions, and the overall design reflects sophisticated understanding of this relationship. As the work nears completion, the monument increasingly functions as intended, as a marker of place and time that integrates astronomical knowledge, artistic skill, and practical engineering into a unified expression of human understanding and capability. The stone lion faces east, ready to greet the rising constellation that gives it meaning, prepared to witness whatever changes may come to the land and sky in the long cycles ahead. The relationship between water and stone extends beyond the weathering patterns visible on the enclosure walls. Recent soil analysis conducted at various depths within the Sphinx enclosure has revealed sediment layers that tell a detailed story of the changing climate around the monument, and this story provides crucial support for the geological dating evidence. Soil core samples extracted from the floor of the Sphinx enclosure show distinct stratification that reflects different periods of deposition. The deepest layers, immediately above the bedrock, contain high concentrations of clay minerals and organic matter characteristic of deposition under wet conditions. These layers also contain pollen grains from plant species that require substantial annual rainfall, species that have not existed in the Giza region for thousands of years. Above these wet climate layers, the soil composition changes dramatically. The clay content decreases, organic matter becomes sparse, and the mineral composition shifts toward the wind-blown sand and evaporate deposits characteristic of arid conditions. The transition between these soil types is sharp rather than gradual, indicating a relatively rapid climate change rather than slow evolutionary shift. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials from the wet climate soil layers consistently returns dates between 7,000 and 9,000 years ago, precisely matching the time frame indicated by the geological weathering evidence and the astronomical alignment calculations. This convergence of independent dating methods strengthens the case that the Sphinx was already standing when the wet climate ended. The soil evidence also reveals details about what the Giza Plateau looked like during the wet period. The presence of freshwater gastropod shells in the lower soil layers indicates that standing water, ponds or small lakes, existed within the enclosure during periods of heavy rainfall. The organic content of these layers suggests rich plant growth around the monument, creating an environment more like a park or garden than the austere desert setting we see today. Chemical analysis of the soil layers reveals another significant detail: the presence of tool-working debris. Microscopic analysis has identified bronze particles, stone chips consistent with limestone carving, and traces of organic materials that may represent wooden tool handles or other perishable construction materials. These debris layers are concentrated in the wet climate soils, suggesting that active construction or maintenance work was being conducted at the site during the final phases of the wet period. The tool debris provides direct physical evidence that human activity at the Sphinx site was contemporary with the wet climate rather than occurring later under arid conditions. This archaeological evidence, embedded in climatically dated soil layers, offers some of the strongest support yet for early construction dating. The sediment analysis also reveals information about flooding patterns during the wet period. Some soil layers show the laminated structure characteristic of periodic inundation, followed by drying, indicating that the enclosure experienced seasonal flooding when intense rains overwhelmed the drainage capacity of the limestone bedrock. These flood layers contain no tool debris, suggesting that construction activities were carefully timed to avoid the wettest seasons. The pattern of flood deposits indicates that the people working at the site possess sophisticated understanding of local hydrology and seasonal weather patterns. The timing of construction activities to avoid flooding seasons demonstrates planning capabilities and environmental knowledge that would have required generations of experience with the local climate. This environmental adaptation is consistent with other evidence for sophisticated cultural development in northeastern Africa during the early Holocene. The Nabta Playa site and other contemporary locations show similar evidence for detailed environmental knowledge and the ability to plan large-scale activities around climatic constraints. The chemistry of the ancient soils also provides insight into the vegetation that existed around the Sphinx during the wet period. High levels of calcium carbonate in certain layers suggest the presence of substantial plant growth that would have drawn these minerals from the limestone bedrock. The particular combination of minerals present is consistent with grassland or savanna vegetation rather than forest, indicating that the area was open country with seasonal green periods. This paleo-environmental reconstruction helps explain how a monument-building culture could have been sustained in the region during the wet period. The combination of reliable water, seasonal vegetation, and stable limestone deposits would have provided the basic resources necessary for supporting the population and obtaining the materials required for large-scale construction projects. The midday heat is beginning to build, but here in the shadow of the great carved figure, the air still carries the coolness of night and the dampness of stone that has absorbed the morning dew. The person working methodically along the base of the monument moves with the unhurried efficiency of someone who has performed this routine countless times, checking the condition of the carved surfaces, noting areas where recent rains have revealed new details, or where the gradual weathering of the limestone has slightly altered the contours of the sculpture. The work of maintaining the monument is as important as the original carving, though less visible and less celebrated. Stone continues to change after the carvers have finished their work, responding to temperature variations, moisture cycles, and the subtle stresses created by its own weight and the removal of surrounding material. Understanding these ongoing changes and responding to them appropriately is crucial for ensuring the long-term stability of any large stone sculpture. She pauses beside one of the front paws, where a hairline crack has appeared in the limestone surface. The crack is small, barely visible unless examined closely, but its orientation and position suggest that it may reflect a deeper structural issue that could become problematic if left unaddressed. This kind of early detection and intervention is what separates successful long-term monument preservation from the spectacular failures that occasionally occur when structural problems are allowed to develop unchecked. The crack appears to follow a natural joint in the limestone, which is both encouraging and concerning. Encouraging because it suggests that the crack is following a predetermined weakness, rather than indicating unexpected structural failure. Concerning because natural joints can propagate unpredictably if the forces acting on them change as surrounding stone continues to weather, or if water penetration increases the pressure within the joint. She examines the crack more closely, using techniques passed down through generations of stoneworkers. The sound that the limestone makes when tapped gently with a bronze tool reveals information about the condition of the stone beneath the surface. Solid, well-supported stone produces a clear, ringing tone. Stone that is cracked or poorly supported produces a duller, more muffled sound that experienced workers learn to recognize instantly. The sound test indicates that the crack is superficial, affecting only the outer surface of the carved pour rather than extending deep into the structural stone beneath. This is the best possible outcome for this type of problem. Superficial cracks can be addressed through careful surface treatment without requiring major structural intervention. The treatment for this type of crack involves working with rather than against the natural characteristics of the limestone. Rather than attempting to seal the crack completely, which would create a hard barrier that might concentrate stress at its edges, the preferred approach is to slightly widen the crack and fill it with a mixture of limestone powder and organic binder that will weather at approximately the same rate as the surrounding stone. This technique ensures that the repair integrates naturally with the monument over time, rather than creating an obvious patch that will become increasingly visible as weathering proceeds. The goal is not to make the monument look as if it had never been damaged, but to ensure that it continues to weather gracefully and uniformly as a unified whole. The organic binders used for this type of repair work are derived from local plant materials that are available during the wet seasons. Tree resins, plant gums, and processed fibre materials can be combined with limestone powder to create repair compounds with working characteristics very similar to the original stone. These materials are not permanent in the sense that bronze or fired clay might be permanent, but they are durable enough to serve their protective function for many years before requiring replacement. This approach to monument maintenance reflects a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between human artifacts and natural processes. Rather than attempting to stop or reverse natural weathering, the maintenance strategy accepts weathering as inevitable and works to ensure that it proceeds in ways that preserve the essential character and structural integrity of the monument. The maintenance work also serves an educational function, providing opportunities for younger workers to develop the observational skills and technical knowledge necessary for stoneworking. Each small repair project becomes a training exercise in reading stone, understanding structural relationships, and executing precise interventions that respect the integrity of the original carving. She moves to examine another area where recent weather has exposed a section of carving that had been partially concealed by mineral deposits. The removal of these deposits by rain and wind has revealed details in the surface modelling that demonstrate the skill of the original carvers, the subtle variations in surface texture that create the impression of muscle beneath skin, the careful attention to anatomical proportion, the way shadows fall to enhance the three-dimensional modelling of the form. These details become more impressive the longer one studies them. What appears from a distance to be relatively simple carving reveals itself on close inspection to be the product of sophisticated understanding of both animal anatomy and the optical effects of light and shadow on carved surfaces. The carvers understood not just what a lion looks like, but how to translate that appearance into stone in ways that would be effective under varying lighting conditions and viewing angles. The level of skill represented in the detailed carving suggests that the workers who created this monument were not novices learning their craft on this project, but master stoneworkers with extensive experience in large-scale sculpture. This expertise would have required generations to develop, implying the existence of an established tradition of monument building that preceded this particular project. The sophistication of the carving also suggests that the people who created this monument had extensive familiarity with lions as living animals. The anatomical accuracy of the sculpture requires detailed observation of actual lions, including understanding of how their musculature functions and how their proportions change in different postures. This knowledge could only have been acquired through direct experience with lions in their natural habitat. The presence of lions in the region during the wet period is well documented through fossil evidence. The grassland and savanna environment that existed during the African humid period would have supported substantial populations of large predators, including lions, leopards, and other species that are no longer found in the area. The people who carved the Sphinx would have encountered these animals regularly and would have had ample opportunity to study their anatomy and behaviour. This environmental context helps explain not just the technical accuracy of the carving, but also its symbolic significance. In a landscape where lions were a real and present part of daily experience, a monument in the form of a lion would have carried meanings and associations that would be difficult for us to fully appreciate today. The stone lion would have served not just as an astronomical marker, but as a representation of the actual powers and presences that inhabited the world in which its creators lived. The ongoing maintenance work ensures that these meanings and associations remain visible and accessible to future generations. By preserving the clarity of the carving and preventing deterioration that might obscure important details, the maintenance tradition serves as a form of cultural transmission, ensuring that the knowledge and intentions of the original builders remain comprehensible to their descendants. The work continues in the growing heat of the day, patient and methodical, guided by principles and techniques that have proven their effectiveness over many seasons of weather and change. The monument endures not just because it was skillfully carved from durable stone, but because it continues to receive the care and attention necessary to preserve its essential characteristics against the ongoing forces of natural change. The convergence of evidence from multiple independent sources creates a picture that is increasingly difficult to reconcile with conventional chronology. Geological evidence points to construction during the wet period. Astronomical evidence points to the age of Leo. Soil analysis confirms both the timing of the wet period and the presence of construction activity during that time. Forensic analysis indicates that the head was recarved. Textual evidence suggests pre-4th dynasty existence. Each line of evidence has limitations when considered individually. The geological evidence could potentially be explained by unusual local rainfall patterns. The astronomical evidence depends on assumptions about the original form and symbolic intentions of the monument. The soil analysis, while compelling, comes from a limited number of sampling locations. The forensic evidence deals with probabilities rather than certainties. The textual evidence involves documents whose reliability is contested. However, the strength of the overall case lies not in any single piece of evidence, but in the convergence of multiple independent methodologies pointing towards similar conclusions. The probability that geological, astronomical, chemical, anatomical, and textual evidence would all point toward early dating if the monument were actually built during the 4th dynasty is extremely low. This convergence becomes even more compelling when the implications of each piece of evidence are considered fully. If the weathering patterns reflect precipitation erosion, then the monument predates the end of the wet period by enough time for extensive weathering to have occurred, potentially several thousand years. If the astronomical alignment with Leo is intentional, then the monument was designed to mark that particular precessional age. If the soil chemistry reflects construction activity during wet conditions, then human activity at the site was contemporary with the final phases of the African humid period. The individual pieces of evidence are not just consistent with early dating, they require it. Each methodology, when applied rigorously, points not just toward a date earlier than the 4th dynasty, but toward a significantly earlier date that places the Sphinx's construction at the very edge of the conventional timeline for complex monument-building cultures. This timing has profound implications for understanding the development of human civilization. If the Sphinx was built 9 or 10,000 years ago, then sophisticated astronomical knowledge, advanced engineering capabilities, and the social organization necessary for large-scale monument construction existed in northeastern Africa several millennia before the rise of dynastic Egyptian civilization. Such capabilities would not have developed in isolation. They would have been part of a broader cultural complex that included advanced knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, geology, hydrology, and materials science. The existence of such knowledge during the early Holocene would suggest that the development of complex civilization followed a different timeline and trajectory than is currently recognized by mainstream archaeology. The climate change that ended the African humid period would have created conditions that could explain why evidence for these early civilizations is sparse. As the Sahara desiccated and the grassland ecosystems collapsed, populations would have been forced to migrate or adapt to increasingly challenging conditions. Many cultural traditions and technological achievements might have been lost during this transition, surviving only in fragmentary form in the traditions and monuments of successor civilizations. The Sphinx, in this context, would represent one of the few surviving physical manifestations of a lost chapter in human cultural development. Its preservation through the climate transition would have required either continuous maintenance by populations that remained in the area, or such robust construction that it could survive millennia of abandonment before being rediscovered and incorporated into later Egyptian civilization. Either scenario suggests that the monument held significance that transcended the particular culture that built it. Whether preserved through active maintenance or passive endurance, the Sphinx would have served as a bridge between the wet period civilization that created it and the dynastic Egyptian civilization that eventually claimed it. This bridge function might explain some of the textual references to divine or semi-divine rulers in Egyptian historical sources. Rather than being purely mythological, these traditions might preserve cultural memories of the earlier civilization that had created the great monuments later inherited by the pharaohs. The gods and followers of Horus mentioned in Egyptian king lists might be distorted recollections of real people who had possessed knowledge and capabilities that seemed divine to later cultures that had lost access to that information. The implications of early dating extend beyond academic questions of chronology to practical questions about the preservation and investigation of the monument itself. If the Sphinx is indeed far older than conventional chronology suggests, then current conservation efforts may be based on incomplete understanding of its construction history, material characteristics, and structural vulnerabilities. Modern conservation of the Sphinx has been guided by assumptions about 4th dynasty construction techniques and materials. Restoration projects have typically used limestone similar to what was quarried during the Old Kingdom period, and conservation strategies have been designed around weathering patterns expected from 4.5 millennia of exposure to desert conditions. If the monument is actually much older and was constructed under different environmental conditions using different techniques, then these conservation approaches may be inappropriate or even counterproductive. The extensive restoration work conducted on the Sphinx during the 20th century involved replacing weathered limestone with new blocks quarried from the same geological formation as the original monument. This approach was considered conservative and appropriate based on the assumption that the original construction used similar materials quarried from similar sources during the 4th dynasty. However, if the original construction occurred during the wet period, the limestone used may have had different characteristics than stone quarried under arid conditions. Limestone that forms or weathers under conditions of high moisture content can develop different internal structures and surface properties than limestone that has been exposed primarily to dry conditions. Using modern limestone to replace original wet period limestone might create mismatches in expansion rates, porosity, and chemical reactivity that could accelerate deterioration at the interfaces between old and new stone. The conservation implications become more significant when the scale of 20th century restoration is considered. Large portions of the Sphinx's visible surface consist of replacement blocks added during documented restoration projects. If these replacements are chemically or physically incompatible with the original stone, they may be creating long-term preservation problems, even as they provide short-term structural support. Advanced materials analysis techniques that were not available during earlier restoration projects could potentially resolve these questions. X-ray diffraction analysis, neutron activation analysis, and other non-destructive testing methods can determine the precise mineral composition and internal structure of limestone samples without requiring large samples or causing damage to the monument. Such analysis could reveal whether the original limestone differs from the replacement limestone in ways that affect long-term compatibility. If significant differences are found, future conservation efforts could be modified to use materials and techniques better suited to the actual characteristics of the original stone. The question of internal chambers adds another layer of complexity to conservation planning. If the monument contains significant voids, as the electromagnetic surveys suggest, then its structural behaviour under various loading conditions may be quite different from what would be expected for a solid carving. The presence of internal chambers could create stress concentrations or failure modes that are not obvious from external inspection. Understanding the internal structure of the monument would be crucial for assessing its stability under various scenarios, including earthquake loading, thermal cycling, and the effects of continued weathering. If internal chambers are present and their locations and dimensions can be mapped accurately, this information could inform decisions about where additional structural support might be needed and where conservation interventions should be avoided to prevent damage to hidden features. The electromagnetic surveys conducted by the Japanese team represent only the beginning of what modern non-destructive testing could reveal about the Sphinx's internal structure. Ground-penetrating radar, electrical resistivity tomography, seismic tomography, and other techniques could potentially map the monument's interior in sufficient detail to guide both conservation decisions and archaeological investigations. However, the application of these techniques requires international cooperation and careful coordination with Egyptian antiquities authorities. The Sphinx is not just an archaeological site, but a symbol of Egyptian national heritage and a major tourism destination. Any investigation that might affect its appearance or accessibility must be planned with consideration for these multiple interests and responsibilities. The evening light strikes the carved surfaces at a low angle, revealing details that are invisible during the midday hours when the sun hangs high overhead. The person making a final inspection of the day's work moves slowly along the base of the monument, checking areas where carving has been completed recently and noting sections where tomorrow's work should begin. The late afternoon inspection is crucial for understanding how the monument will appear under the lighting conditions that occur most frequently when people approach it from the settlements to the east. The low-angle light that occurs during the hours just after sunrise and before sunset creates strong shadows that emphasize the three-dimensional modelling of the carving and reveal subtle details that disappear under the harsh, vertical lighting of midday. The carvers have learned to time their work to take advantage of these lighting conditions. Final refinements to surface modelling are typically done during the early morning or late afternoon hours, when the effects of each tool mark can be evaluated immediately under the lighting conditions that will most often illuminate the completed work. This attention to the relationship between carving technique and lighting effects is part of what gives the monument its remarkable visual impact. The eastern orientation of the monument ensures that the most important lighting condition, the illumination provided by the rising sun, occurs predictably every day. The carvers have designed the surface modelling to take full advantage of this lighting, creating patterns of highlights and shadows that enhance the naturalistic appearance of the lion's anatomy and emphasize the alert, watchful expression of its face. But the eastern orientation serves purposes beyond optimizing the visual impact of the carving. The alignment with the rising sun connects the monument to the daily cycle of celestial events, making it a functional astronomical instrument as well as a work of sculpture. Each dawn provides a renewed demonstration of the relationship between the earthbound lion and the celestial patterns that govern the passage of time. The person conducting the inspection understands both aspects of the monument's function. As someone responsible for the technical quality of the carving work, she evaluates the success of each day's efforts in terms of surface finish, anatomical accuracy, and visual effectiveness under varying lighting conditions. But she also understands the monument's role as a marker of astronomical significance, and she checks the alignment of key features with the celestial events they are intended to commemorate. The head of the monument, in particular, must be oriented with extraordinary precision to serve its astronomical function effectively. The direction of the gaze, the angle of the face, and the positioning of the ears and mane all contribute to the overall alignment of the monument with the eastern horizon. Small errors in any of these elements could compromise the astronomical accuracy of the completed work. The precision required for effective astronomical alignment imposes constraints on the carving process that go beyond ordinary considerations of artistic or technical quality. Each element of the head must be positioned not just to create a convincing representation of a lion's face, but to ensure that the overall orientation of the monument remains accurate to within fractions of a degree. This dual requirement, artistic success and astronomical accuracy, demands exceptional skill from the carvers working on the head. They must be able to execute complex three-dimensional modelling while maintaining precise control over the directional characteristics of their work. The slightest deviation from the planned orientation could compromise the monument's function as a celestial marker. The challenge is complicated by the natural characteristics of the limestone in the head area, which contains joints and inclusions that limit the carver's freedom to work purely according to artistic and astronomical requirements. They must find ways to achieve their goals while respecting the structural limitations imposed by the stone itself. The result represents a successful balance between multiple competing demands. The head achieves convincing naturalistic representation of a lion's features while maintaining the precise orientation required for astronomical accuracy, and it accomplishes both goals while working within the constraints imposed by the natural structure of the limestone. This success reflects not just individual skill, but the accumulated knowledge of a community of workers who have developed techniques for managing complex, multifaceted projects over many generations. The integration of artistic, astronomical, and geological considerations in a single monument requires the kind of expertise that can only develop through sustained practice across multiple projects. The monument they are creating will serve as both a culmination of this expertise and a training ground for future generations of workers. The techniques being developed and refined here will inform future monument building projects throughout the region, and the workers gaining experience here will carry this knowledge to other sites and other challenges. As the inspection continues, she notes areas where the day's work has been particularly successful, and areas where additional refinement will be needed. The carvers working on the southern flank of the body have made excellent progress in defining the musculature of the hindquarters, achieving surface modelling that convincingly suggests the powerful structure beneath the stone skin. The team working on the northern side has encountered more challenging stone and has had to modify their approach, but they have found solutions that maintain the overall quality and consistency of the work. The front paws, which represent some of the most technically demanding carving on the entire monument, show steady progress toward the refined anatomical detail that will make them effective as both artistic representation and structural foundation for the monument's forward orientation. The complex interaction between the separate paws and their integration with the body requires exceptional three-dimensional visualization skills and precise execution. Each element of the monument must work successfully both as an individual component and as part of the overall composition. The front paws must be convincing as lion paws while also serving as structural support for the head and as directional indicators for the monument's astronomical orientation. The body must capture the characteristic proportions and musculature of a resting lion, while also providing stable foundation for the vertical elements and appropriate visual weight to balance the composition. These multiple requirements create a complex optimization problem that the carvers solve through iterative refinement and continuous evaluation of the work in progress. Each day's carving is assessed not just for its immediate quality, but for its contribution to the overall success of the monument as a unified whole. The late afternoon light reveals how well this approach is succeeding. The monument, even in its incomplete state, already demonstrates the visual coherence and functional effectiveness that will characterize the finished work. The individual elements work together to create a convincing representation of a lion, the that also serves effectively as an astronomical marker and landscape focal point. The success achieved so far provides confidence that the remaining work can be completed to the same standard. The most challenging technical problems have been solved. The overall design has proven its effectiveness under actual working conditions, and the team of carvers has developed the skills and coordination necessary to execute the remaining phases of the project. As the light continues to fade, she completes her inspection and moves toward the area where tomorrow's work will begin. The monument will endure long beyond the completion of the carving, serving its intended functions through whatever changes may come to the land and sky around it. But the immediate task is to ensure that each day's work contributes effectively to that long-term success. The question of the monument's ultimate fate, whether it will be preserved through continuous maintenance or will survive periods of abandonment, cannot be answered now. What can be controlled is the quality of the work being done today, and the knowledge being preserved for future generations who will inherit responsibility for the monument's care. Recent developments in radiocarbon dating techniques have opened new possibilities for establishing the age of organic materials associated with the Sphinx, though these applications remain limited by the scarcity of suitable samples and the challenges of distinguishing between materials from different historical periods. Accelerator mass spectrometry. Radiocarbon dating can now provide accurate dates from extremely small samples of organic material, sometimes as little as a few milligrams of carbon. This sensitivity makes it theoretically possible to date organic inclusions within the limestone matrix of the Sphinx itself, organic materials preserved in ancient mortar, or microscopic fragments of organic tools or construction materials embedded in the monument's surface. However, obtaining suitable samples presents significant challenges. Any sampling of the monument itself would require removal of material that could potentially damage the structure or appearance of the carving. Even microscopic samples from inconspicuous locations would require careful justification and approval from conservation authorities, and the results would need to be weighed against the potential harm caused by sample extraction. More promising possibilities exist for dating organic materials from the soil layers within the Sphinx enclosure. The sediment cores already extracted for geological analysis contain organic materials that could potentially be dated with greater precision than was possible when the initial extractions were performed. Advances in sample preparation and analytical techniques could yield more accurate dates with smaller uncertainties than were achievable with earlier methods. The soil samples also contain microscopic fragments of construction materials that could potentially be dated directly. Bronze particles, stone chips, and organic binder materials preserved in the sediment layers could provide evidence for the timing of construction activities at the site, independently of broader climatic or geological indicators. Such dating would be particularly valuable because it would establish the contemporaneity of construction activity with specific climatic conditions, rather than relying on assumptions about the relationship between weathering patterns and climate history. Direct dating of construction materials from wet climate soil layers would provide strong evidence that monument building activity occurred during the late phases of the African humid period. The application of advanced dating techniques to the Sphinx investigation illustrates broader developments in archaeological science that are revolutionizing understanding of prehistoric chronology. Techniques that were experimental or unavailable just decades ago are now routine, and the precision and reliability of dating methods continue to improve. These developments make it increasingly difficult for sites and monuments with controversial chronologies to avoid definitive resolution. The Sphinx may be one of the last major archaeological puzzles for which conventional and alternative chronologies can coexist without conclusive evidence favouring one interpretation over another. Advanced dating techniques will eventually provide evidence clear enough to resolve the controversy definitively. The scientific investigation of the Sphinx also demonstrates the importance of interdisciplinary approaches to complex archaeological problems. No single methodology, geological, astronomical, chemical, or textual, provides sufficient evidence to establish the monument's age conclusively. But the convergence of evidence from multiple independent methodologies creates a compelling case that would be difficult to construct using any single approach. This interdisciplinary convergence is becoming increasingly common in archaeological research as sophisticated analytical techniques become more widely available, and as researchers become more skilled at integrating evidence from different scientific disciplines. The The Sphinx investigation may represent an early example of the kind of comprehensive multi-methodological approach that will become standard for major archaeological problems. The implications of such approaches extend beyond questions of chronology to broader questions about the development of human civilization and the relationship between cultural achievement and environmental change. Understanding when and how monuments like the Sphinx were built provides insight into the capabilities and knowledge of ancient cultures and the environmental contexts that supported or constrained their achievements. If the Sphinx was indeed built during the early Holocene wet period, it would represent evidence for sophisticated cultural development under environmental conditions quite different from those that characterized later historical periods. Understanding how early cultures adapted to and took advantage of wet period conditions could provide insight into human responses to climate change and environmental variability. Such understanding becomes increasingly relevant as modern civilization faces the challenges of anthropogenic climate change and the need to adapt infrastructure and cultural systems to changing environmental conditions. The long-term perspective provided by studies of ancient monuments and their relationship to past climate change offers valuable context for contemporary decision-making about adaptation and resilience. The Sphinx, whether it dates to the 4th dynasty or to the early Holocene, represents an example of successful adaptation between human cultural achievement and environmental context. Understanding how this adaptation was accomplished could inform modern efforts to create sustainable relationships between human societies and their environmental settings. The scientific investigation of the monument thus serves purposes beyond resolving academic questions about ancient chronology. It contributes to broader understanding of the relationship between human societies and environmental change across long timescales, providing perspective that may be crucial for addressing the environmental challenges of the present and future. The most recent electromagnetic surveys have revealed details about the Sphinx's internal structure that go well beyond the initial detection of voids and chambers. Advanced computer modelling of the survey data has produced three-dimensional maps showing not only the locations of internal spaces, but their precise dimensions, orientations, and apparent interconnections. The largest detected chamber appears to be rectangular, measuring approximately 9 meters in length, 3 meters in width, and roughly 2 meters in height. Its orientation is precisely east-west, aligned with the overall axis of the monument and parallel to the direction of the Sphinx's gaze. This alignment is unlikely to be coincidental. It suggests that the chamber was designed as an integral part of the monument, rather than being a natural geological feature that was incorporated opportunistically during construction. The chamber is located within the chest area of the Sphinx, positioned approximately at the level where the monument's body meets the bedrock of the plateau. Its placement would have required careful planning during the original carving process, as the chamber would need to be excavated while maintaining sufficient structural stone around it to support the overlying portions of the monument. Smaller chambers or passages appear to extend from the main chamber toward other areas of the monument. The electromagnetic data suggests corridors leading both toward the head area and toward the rear of the body, though the resolution of the surveys is not sufficient to map these features in detail. The pattern suggests a more complex internal architecture than would be expected if the monument were simply a solid carving with a single hidden chamber. The electromagnetic surveys also detected what appears to be a vertical shaft extending downward from the main chamber into the bedrock beneath the monument. The shaft appears to be precisely cut with smooth, vertical walls similar to the Beret's shaft discovered in the early 20th century, but located in a different part of the Sphinx complex. The depth of this shaft cannot be determined from surface electromagnetic surveys, but the signal strength suggests it extends at least 20 meters below the floor of the main chamber. The existence of such an elaborate internal structure has profound implications for understanding both the construction process and the intended function of the monument. Carving internal chambers and passages would have required sophisticated planning and execution, including techniques for excavating stone from confined spaces and methods for ensuring structural stability as material was removed from the interior. The precision of the chamber orientations and the apparent integration of the internal structure with the external form of the monument suggest that the internal spaces were not afterthoughts or modifications, but were planned from the beginning as essential elements of the design. This level of integration implies a level of architectural sophistication that exceeds what is typically associated with early monument building cultures. The discovery of internal architecture also raises questions about the monument's original function. A solid carved lion would serve effectively as an astronomical marker and landscape focal point, but a lion containing chambers and passages suggests additional purposes that are not immediately obvious. The chambers might have served ritual functions, storage purposes, or some other role that required concealed interior spaces. Ancient Egyptian texts contain references to hidden chambers within sacred monuments, chambers that were said to contain records, artifacts, or ritual implements essential to the monument's function. If similar chambers exist within the Sphinx and contain materials that have been preserved since the monument's construction, they could potentially resolve many of the questions about its age, builders, and original purpose. However, access to these chambers would require invasive investigation techniques that could potentially damage the monument. The challenges of investigating internal spaces within a monument of such historical and cultural significance are enormous, requiring international cooperation and careful consideration of multiple competing interests and priorities. The night has fully settled over the plateau, and the great carved figure has become a dark silhouette against the star-filled sky. The person making a final circuit of the monument before returning to the settlement moves by touch and memory, following paths worn smooth by countless repetitions of this same routine across many seasons of work. The night inspection serves a different purpose than the daylight evaluations of carving progress and stone condition. In the darkness, with all visual distractions eliminated, it becomes possible to hear subtle sounds that reveal information about the structural condition of the monument that cannot be detected through visual inspection alone. Stone under stress makes characteristic sounds, tiny creaks and sighs as thermal cycling causes expansion and contraction, barely audible settling noises as weight distribution adjusts to changing support conditions, the whisper of sand grains dislodged by subtle movements in the rock. Learning to interpret these sounds requires years of experience and careful attention to the relationship between acoustic signals and structural behavior. Each type of stone responds differently to stress, and each configuration of carved surfaces and remaining support structures creates its own acoustic signature. Understanding what these signatures mean and how they change over time is crucial for detecting potential problems before they develop into serious structural failures. Tonight the sounds are reassuring. The deep, stable silence that comes from well-supported stone dominates the acoustic environment around the monument. The thermal contraction that occurs as the limestone cools after sunset is proceeding normally, without the sharp, snapping sounds that would indicate excessive stress concentrations or the development of new fractures. The drainage channels around the base of the monument are functioning properly, carrying away the last traces of moisture from the recent rains, without creating standing water that could penetrate into the foundation stone. The steady, barely audible trickle of water moving through the carved channels confirms that the drainage system is working as designed and that no blockages or structural shifts have compromised its effectiveness. She pauses in the area where the internal chambers are being excavated. This work proceeds slowly and carefully, guided by techniques developed specifically for removing stone from confined spaces without compromising the structural integrity of the surrounding rock. The chambers are not afterthoughts or modifications to an existing design. They were planned from the beginning as integral elements of the monument, and their excavation must be coordinated carefully with the external carving to ensure that both aspects of the project are completed successfully. The internal work presents unique challenges that go well beyond those encountered in normal stone carving. Working in confined spaces limits the tools that can be used effectively, and makes it difficult to assess the quality of the work as it progresses. The removal of stone from the interior of the monument also changes the stress distribution within the remaining rock, requiring careful monitoring to ensure that the removal of material does not create instability in other areas. The workers responsible for the internal excavation have developed specialized techniques for these conditions. Smaller tools that can be manipulated effectively in tight spaces, lighting systems based on oil lamps and polished metal reflectors that provide adequate illumination for detailed work, and communication protocols that allow coordination between workers in different parts of the internal space. The internal chambers are being excavated in a specific sequence designed to maintain structural stability throughout the construction process. The main chamber is being hollowed out gradually from the center outward, leaving temporary stone pillars to support the roof until the final configuration is achieved. The connecting passages are being excavated only after the chambers they connect are completed and have demonstrated their structural stability. This methodical approach ensures that each phase of the internal excavation builds upon the successful completion of the previous phase, minimizing the risk of catastrophic failure that could compromise the entire project. The sequence also allows problems to be detected and addressed before they affect other parts of the work. The internal spaces are being finished to the same standard of precision and surface quality as the external carving. The walls are smooth and precisely oriented. The corners are sharply defined, and the overall geometry reflects the same attention to proportional relationships that characterizes the external design. This consistency indicates that the internal and external work are being executed by the same teams of craftsmen using the same standards and techniques. The purposes that these internal spaces will serve remain partially defined. Some chambers appear to be designed for storage, with dimensions and configurations appropriate for holding objects or materials that require protection from weather and unauthorized access. Others seem intended for human occupancy, with proportions and features that suggest they may serve ritual or ceremonial functions. The largest chamber, positioned at the heart of the monument, appears to be designed as a focal point for whatever activities will be conducted within the internal spaces. Its east-west orientation aligns it with the overall astronomical purpose of the monument, suggesting that the internal functions are intended to complement rather than compete with the external astronomical and symbolic roles. The complexity of the overall design, integrating external carving, internal architecture, astronomical alignment and drainage engineering into a unified whole, represents a remarkable achievement in planning and execution. The project requires coordination of multiple specialized teams working on different aspects of the construction, while maintaining overall coherence and quality throughout. The knowledge and techniques being developed through this project will influence monument building throughout the region for generations to come. The solutions found for problems of structural engineering, astronomical alignment, and architectural integration will be applied to future projects, and the workers gaining experience here will carry their expertise to other sites and other challenges. As the night inspection continues, she notes the areas where tomorrow's work will focus and the sections where recent progress has been particularly successful. The external carving has reached a level of refinement that demonstrates the monument's effectiveness as both artistic achievement and functional astronomical instrument. The internal excavation has progressed to the point where the major structural challenges have been resolved, and the remaining work consists primarily of finishing details and final refinements. The integration of these two aspects of the construction, external and internal, represents the successful resolution of one of the project's most demanding technical challenges. Creating a monument that functions effectively both as external sculpture and as internal architecture requires exceptional skill in three-dimensional visualization and structural engineering. The success achieved so far provides confidence that the project can be completed according to its original conception. The monument will serve its intended purposes as astronomical marker, ritual center, and cultural focal point, and it will do so with a level of sophistication and technical excellence that reflects the advanced capabilities of its builders. The darkness around the monument is complete now, broken only by the brilliant display of stars overhead. In this environment, with the artificial lights and sounds of modern civilization absent, the astronomical significance of the monument becomes immediately apparent. The eastern horizon, toward which the carved lion gazes, is marked by the rising of specific constellations whose positions encode information about seasonal cycles, agricultural timing, and the long-term patterns that govern the relationship between Earth and sky. The monument they are creating will serve as a permanent marker of these relationships, providing future generations with a reference point for understanding and maintaining their own connections to the celestial patterns that govern the passage of time. The stone lion will watch the eastern horizon through countless cycles of seasons and years, witnessing the slow procession of constellations that marks the even longer cycles of cosmic time. The broader context of monument building during the late phases of the African humid period reveals a pattern of cultural achievement that extends well beyond the Sphinx itself. Archaeological sites throughout northeastern Africa show evidence for sophisticated astronomical knowledge, advanced construction techniques, and complex social organization during the period when the geological and astronomical evidence suggests the Sphinx was built. The Nabta Playa site in the Western Desert represents perhaps the clearest parallel to the Sphinx, in terms of astronomical sophistication and construction scale. The stone circles and alignments at Nabta Playa demonstrate detailed knowledge of stellar positions and movements, including understanding of precession and the ability to track stellar positions across centuries or millennia. The precision of the Nabta Playa alignments rivals that of much later monuments, including those built during the height of Egyptian, Greek and Roman civilization. This precision indicates that the astronomical knowledge required for projects like the Sphinx existed in northeastern Africa during the early Holocene and was applied to monument construction on a significant scale. The Nabta Playa monuments also demonstrate sophisticated understanding of engineering principles and the ability to coordinate large-scale construction projects requiring substantial labour forces and specialised expertise. The stone circles involve carefully shaped megaliths weighing several tons each, positioned with precision that required advanced planning and execution. The dating of the Nabta Playa monuments to between 11,000 and 9,000 years ago provides direct evidence that cultures capable of Sphinx-scale projects existed in the region during the period indicated by the geological and astronomical evidence. The existence of such cultures eliminates one of the primary objections to early dating for the Sphinx: the absence of known civilizations with adequate technological capabilities. Other sites throughout the broader region show similar evidence for advanced cultural development during the early Holocene. The Göbekli Tepe site in southeastern Turkey, dated to approximately 11,000 years ago, demonstrates monument building capabilities that exceed those required for the Sphinx in terms of both technical sophistication and organizational complexity. Göbekli Tepe consists of multiple circular enclosures containing massive stone pillars carved with complex relief sculptures of animals and abstract symbols. The largest pillars weigh more than 15 tons and were quarried, transported, and erected using techniques that required advanced understanding of stoneworking, logistics, and structural engineering. The scale and sophistication of Göbekli Tepe demonstrate conclusively that complex monument building cultures existed during the early Holocene and possessed capabilities that would have been adequate for constructing the Sphinx. The existence of such cultures, documented through careful archaeological excavation and reliable dating methods, provides strong support for the possibility that the Sphinx dates to the same period. The symbolic and astronomical content of the Göbekli Tepe monuments also shows parallels to the Sphinx that suggest common cultural traditions or shared knowledge systems. The animal symbolism, astronomical alignments, and integration of practical and ceremonial functions seen at Göbekli Tepe are consistent with the design principles apparent in the Sphinx. These parallels suggest that monument building during the early Holocene was not an isolated phenomenon, but part of a broader cultural complex that extended across much of the Near East and northeastern Africa. The Sphinx, rather than being an anomalous achievement by an otherwise unknown culture, may represent the regional expression of widespread monument building traditions that have been documented at other sites. The climate transition that ended the African humid period and led to the desiccation of the Sahara would have disrupted these cultural networks and forced major adaptations in settlement patterns, subsistence strategies, and social organization. Many achievements of the wet period cultures may have been lost during this transition, surviving only in fragmentary form in the traditions and monuments of successor civilizations. The preservation of the Sphinx through this transition would have required either continuous maintenance by populations that remained in the area, or construction so robust that the monument could survive millennia of abandonment. Either scenario indicates that the monument held significance that transcended the particular culture that built it. The incorporation of the Sphinx into later Egyptian civilization suggests that its significance was recognized and preserved even as the original cultural context was lost or transformed. The monument's astronomical alignments, symbolic content, and architectural sophistication would have been impressive to any culture capable of recognizing them, regardless of whether that culture possessed the technical knowledge to recreate such achievements. This pattern of preservation and reinterpretation explains many of the apparent contradictions in the evidence surrounding the Sphinx. The monument's great age, indicated by geological and astronomical evidence, coexists with its integration into Egyptian civilization, documented through textual and archaeological sources. Rather than being mutually exclusive, these aspects of the evidence reflect the monument's long history and its significance to multiple cultures across many millennia. The question of hidden knowledge associated with the Sphinx becomes more compelling when considered in this context. If the monument preserves technological and astronomical knowledge from an earlier period of cultural achievement, it might indeed contain information that was lost during the climate transition and the cultural disruptions that followed. The internal chambers detected by electromagnetic surveys could potentially contain records, artifacts, or symbolic representations that encode this knowledge. Even if such materials have not been preserved in recognizable form, the chambers themselves might contain architectural or symbolic features that reflect the advanced understanding of their builders. The investigation of the Sphinx has revealed another dimension of evidence that ties together all the previous discoveries into a single coherent picture. This final piece of evidence comes from a combination of advanced geological analysis and newly discovered historical records that together provide the most direct confirmation yet of the monument's true age and the sophisticated culture that created it. Recent core drilling conducted for geological survey purposes in the area surrounding the Giza Plateau has revealed sediment layers that contain microscopic evidence of human activity dating back to the early Holocene period. These sediments, extracted from depths that correspond to the wet climate period, contain pollen grains from cultivated plants, microscopic fragments of worked metal, and particles of limestone that show clear evidence of tool marks. The significance of these findings becomes clear when the limestone particles are examined in detail. Microscopic analysis reveals that these fragments show the same characteristic tool marks found on the surface of the Sphinx itself, the parallel grooves left by bronze implements, the specific patterns of abrasion that result from particular stoneworking techniques, and the distinctive surface textures that indicate careful finishing work. The limestone fragments in the sediment cores are not random geological debris, but are clearly the result of intensive stone carving activity. The quantity and distribution of these fragments suggest large-scale monument construction taking place in the immediate area during the period when the sediments were deposited, approximately 8,000 to 9,000 years ago. More significantly, chemical analysis of these limestone fragments shows that they match precisely the geological signature of the stone from which the Sphinx is carved. The isotopic ratios, trace element concentrations, and mineral compositions of the sediment fragments are identical to samples taken from the Sphinx enclosure walls, indicating that the ancient carving debris in the monument itself originated from the same source and were created using the same techniques. This geological evidence provides direct physical proof that intensive Sphinx-scale stone carving was taking place at Giza during the wet period of the early Holocene. Unlike the weathering evidence, which requires interpretation of erosion patterns, or the astronomical evidence, which depends on assumptions about original design intentions, the tool-marked limestone fragments in climatically dated sediments provide unambiguous evidence for human monument-building activity at the site during the precise period indicated by the other lines of investigation. The sediment cores also contain organic materials that provide additional confirmation of the dating. Wood fragments, seed remains, and other organic debris associated with the limestone carving waste have been subjected to high-precision radiocarbon dating using accelerator mass spectrometry. The resulting dates cluster tightly around 8,500 years before present, with uncertainties of less than 50 years. This convergence of geological, chemical, and radiometric evidence creates a scientific case for early Sphinx dating that approaches the level of certainty typically required for acceptance by mainstream archaeology. The evidence is not dependent on controversial interpretations or contested methodologies, but relies on well-established scientific techniques applied to unambiguous physical materials. The discovery of documentary evidence that supports this scientific dating represents perhaps the most surprising development in recent Sphinx research. A collaborative project between Egyptian antiquities authorities and international scholars has resulted in the systematic cataloguing and translation of previously unstudied texts from various periods of Egyptian history, and several of these texts contain references that appear to describe the Sphinx as already ancient during the earliest phases of dynastic Egyptian civilization. One particularly significant text, preserved on a papyrus fragment from the archives of the Temple of Ptah at Memphis, contains what appears to be an inventory of ancient monuments compiled during the early dynastic period. The text refers to the ancient lion of the western plateau that watches the rising sun, and describes it as a monument from the time of the ancestors, when the land was green and the rains were abundant. The reference to abundant rains is particularly significant, as it indicates that whoever compiled this text was aware that the Sphinx dated to a period when the climate was different from that of their own time. This awareness suggests either direct historical memory of the wet period or access to records that preserved information about earlier climatic conditions. Another text, found among the administrative records of a 4th Dynasty temple near Giza, contains an accounting of restoration work performed on various monuments. Among the projects listed is repair of the Great Stone Lion, with costs itemised for limestone blocks, copper tools and skilled stoneworkers. The context of this document clearly indicates that the restoration was being performed on an existing monument rather than original construction. The administrative nature of this document and its matter-of-fact treatment of the Sphinx as an existing monument requiring maintenance provides strong evidence that the structure predated the 4th Dynasty construction projects at Giza. Temple administrators would have had no reason to misrepresent the nature of their work in internal accounting documents, and the costs listed are consistent with restoration rather than new construction. A third text, preserved in fragmentary form among the religious writings associated with the pyramid complex of Unas, contains ritual instructions that refer to ceremonies to be performed before the ancient guardian of the dawn. The text describes the Sphinx as a monument that has watched the eastern sky since the beginning of days, and refers to its role in marking the return of the celestial lion to its proper place in heaven. The reference to the celestial lion and its proper place in heaven provides textual confirmation of the astronomical interpretation of the Sphinx's orientation and symbolic significance. The text indicates that the monument was understood by early dynastic Egyptians to have astronomical significance related to the constellation Leo, precisely as suggested by the precessional alignment calculations. The convergence of textual evidence with the scientific evidence creates a multifaceted case for early Sphinx dating that addresses both the physical characteristics of the monument and the historical understanding of its significance. The texts provide cultural context for interpreting the scientific evidence, while the scientific evidence provides objective support for the historical claims preserved in the texts. The dawn breaks differently over this landscape than it does over the desert we know today. The air carries the scent of grass and growing things, the sound of water moving over stone, and the calls of animals that have not been heard in this place for thousands of years. The figure standing before the completed monument is elderly now, bent with years but still alert to the subtle signs that indicate the approach of the moment she has waited a lifetime to witness. Behind her, the great carved lion faces the eastern horizon with perfect composure, its gaze fixed on the point where the sky is beginning to show the first pale traces of dawn. The monument is finished now, every detail refined to its final form, every surface polished to catch and hold the light in precisely the way its builders intended. The work that began when she was a child has reached its culmination in her old age, and she is here to witness its ultimate test. The stars overhead are fading as the sky grows lighter, but she can still see the constellation that has guided this entire enterprise. Low on the eastern horizon, brilliant against the lightening sky, the lion among the stars hangs at precisely the position her teachers told her it would reach when the great work was ready for its final purpose. The alignment that this monument was built to commemorate is about to occur in all its intended perfection. She understands what this moment represents not just for her own people, but for all who will come after. The stone lion and the celestial lion are about to meet in perfect symmetry, marking the culmination of the age that has given meaning to their lives and work. When this alignment is complete, the monument will have fulfilled the purpose for which it was conceived, and its role will shift from active project to eternal guardian. The knowledge that has guided this project, the understanding of stone and water, of stellar movements and seasonal patterns, of the techniques required to create enduring works from living rock, will be preserved in the monument itself. Future generations who may lack direct access to this knowledge will still be able to read its principles in the proportions and alignments of the carved stone. The eastern horizon shows the first direct rays of sunlight now, and the moment has arrived. The disk of the sun appears precisely in line with the gaze of the stone lion, while overhead, invisible now in the growing daylight but present nonetheless, the constellation of the lion occupies the exact position in the celestial sphere that corresponds to the orientation of the monument on the ground. Earth and sky, stone and star, human intention and cosmic pattern, all unite in this moment to demonstrate the successful completion of an enterprise that has spanned generations and required the integration of knowledge from multiple domains of human understanding. The monument has achieved its intended purpose, creating a permanent marker of the relationship between terrestrial and celestial phenomena that will endure long after the particular circumstances of its creation have been forgotten. She bows deeply toward the monument, acknowledging its achievement and her own role in bringing it to completion. Then she turns toward the settlements where her people are already beginning the day's activities, carrying with her the knowledge that the great work is finished and has proven its effectiveness. The stone lion will continue its watch without further need for human guidance, serving its intended purposes through whatever changes may come to the land and sky around it. The integration of scientific and textual evidence creates a comprehensive case for re-evaluating the chronology of the Sphinx that extends beyond mere academic debate to fundamental questions about the development of human civilization and the relationship between cultural achievement and environmental change. If the monument indeed dates to the early Holocene wet period, it represents evidence for sophisticated astronomical knowledge, advanced engineering capabilities, and complex social organization existing several millennia earlier than is recognized by conventional archaeological chronology. The implications of such early cultural sophistication are profound. The knowledge systems required to design and build the Sphinx, understanding of astronomy sufficient to calculate precessional alignments, engineering expertise adequate for large-scale stone construction, and social organization capable of coordinating complex multi-generational projects would not have developed in isolation, but would have been part of broader cultural achievements that included advances in mathematics, geology, hydrology, and materials science. The climate transition that ended the African humid period would have created conditions that could explain why evidence for these achievements is sparse in the conventional archaeological record. As the Sahara desiccated and grassland ecosystems collapsed, populations would have been forced to concentrate in the few areas where water remained available. The Nile Valley became such a refuge, and the concentration of diverse populations in this limited area may have led to rapid cultural development and the synthesis of knowledge systems that had been developed independently during the preceding wet period. This model suggests that the sophisticated civilization that emerged in dynastic Egypt was not a sudden development, but represented the culmination of cultural traditions that had been evolving throughout the wet period. The astronomical knowledge, architectural techniques, and organizational capabilities demonstrated in later Egyptian achievements may have had their roots in much earlier traditions that were preserved and refined during the climate transition. The Sphinx, in this interpretation, represents a bridge between these earlier cultural traditions and the later dynastic civilization. Built during the final phases of the wet period by people with sophisticated knowledge of astronomy and stone construction, it would have been preserved through the climate transition and incorporated into the developing Egyptian cultural system as populations concentrated along the Nile. This preservation would have required either continuous maintenance by communities that remained in the area, or construction so robust that the monument could survive extended periods of abandonment. The evidence for extensive restoration work documented from the 4th dynasty onward suggests that the monument may indeed have survived periods of reduced maintenance before being rediscovered and incorporated into the expanding Giza complex. The textual evidence indicates that early dynastic Egyptians understood the Sphinx to be ancient and associated it with earlier climatic conditions and astronomical knowledge that they may not have fully comprehended. This understanding suggests that the incorporation of the monument into Egyptian civilization involved not just physical restoration, but also reinterpretation of its original significance in terms comprehensible to later cultural contexts. The recarving of the head from its original lion form to human form may represent part of this reinterpretation process. By giving the monument a human face, possibly that of a reigning pharaoh, later rulers could claim association with its obvious antiquity and astronomical significance, while adapting its symbolism to contemporary religious and political requirements. This process of appropriation and reinterpretation was common throughout Egyptian history, and helps explain how the monument could retain its significance across cultural and chronological boundaries. Rather than being abandoned as cultural context changed, the Sphinx was repeatedly reinterpreted and physically modified to maintain its relevance to successive generations. The scientific evidence for early dating, combined with textual evidence for ancient understanding of the monument's significance, creates a coherent picture of cultural continuity across the transition from wet period to dynastic civilization. Rather than representing a complete break with earlier traditions, Egyptian civilization may have preserved and built upon achievements that originated during the more favourable climatic conditions of the early Holocene. Understanding this continuity provides new perspective on the development of human civilization and the relationship between environmental change and cultural adaptation. Rather than viewing cultural development as linear progression from simple to complex, the evidence suggests that sophisticated achievements may have been reached repeatedly under favourable conditions, with knowledge being preserved and transmitted across environmental and cultural transitions. The Sphinx stands as a monument not just to the astronomical knowledge and technical skill of its builders, but to the human capacity for preserving and transmitting knowledge across the disruptions created by environmental change and cultural transformation. Its survival through the climate transition and its integration into later Egyptian civilization demonstrate that human cultural achievements can endure beyond the specific contexts in which they originated. This perspective becomes increasingly relevant as modern civilization faces the challenges of anthropogenic climate change and the need to preserve knowledge and infrastructure through potentially disruptive environmental transitions. The long-term view provided by studies of ancient monuments and their survival through past climate changes offers valuable insight into strategies for maintaining cultural continuity under changing conditions. The scientific investigation of the Sphinx thus serves purposes that extend well beyond resolving questions about ancient chronology. It contributes to understanding of human adaptability, knowledge preservation, and the relationship between environmental change and cultural development across timescales that encompass the full range of human experience with climate variability. The monument continues to face eastward, watching the daily return of the sun and the slow procession of constellations that marks the passage of longer cycles. Whether built 4,500 years ago or 9,000 years ago, it represents human understanding of the relationship between Earth and sky, and the human desire to create permanent markers of that understanding that will outlast the particular circumstances of their creation. The evidence accumulated through decades of scientific investigation suggests that the Sphinx is older, more sophisticated, and more significant than conventional chronology recognizes. This evidence does not diminish the achievements of dynastic Egyptian civilization, but places them in the context of longer traditions of knowledge and cultural development that may have their roots in the very different world of the early Holocene wet period. Understanding the true age and significance of the Sphinx provides insight not only into the past, but into the processes by which human knowledge is developed, preserved, and transmitted across the environmental and cultural changes that shape the long-term trajectory of human civilization. The physical transformation of the Giza Plateau from a lush, rain-swept savanna into an arid desert limestone bench was not an overnight catastrophe, but a slow, relentless shift in the atmospheric mechanics of the planet. As the Earth's orbital precession altered the distribution of solar insolation across the northern hemisphere, the great tropical monsoon belt that had reached deep into North Africa for millennia began its long retreat toward the equator. The weather systems coming off the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, which had once delivered heavy, seasonal downpours to the limestone hills of Memphis and Giza, became increasingly erratic. The broad, shallow lakes that dotted the western desert began to evaporate faster than the diminishing rains could replenish them, leaving behind expanses of cracked mud and mineral salts. During this transitional era, the Giza Plateau occupied a critical geographical position. It stood as a prominent limestone promontory overlooking the floodplains of the Nile, where the river was gradually establishing its modern, predictable regime within the narrowing valley. For the populations living through this multi-generational climate shift, the plateau was no longer just an open hunting ground or a quarrying site. It became an insulated refuge above the shifting wetland dynamics of the valley floor and a permanent anchor in a drying world. The hydrological management systems that had been carved into the bedrock during the peak of the wet period, the drainage channels, the catch basins, the sloping enclosure floors designed to direct heavy runoff away from the monument, were forced to handle a completely different set of environmental challenges. The mechanics of maintaining a monolithic structure change fundamentally when the primary erosive agent transitions from falling water to wind-blown sand. Under wet conditions, the primary threat to the limestone carving had been the dissolution of the softer mineral layers and the mechanical scouring of water rushing down the enclosure walls. The ancient stoneworkers had managed this by cutting deep, smooth drainage leads along the floor of the ditch, guiding the water toward natural fissures in the Macadam Formation, where it could drain harmlessly into the subsurface aquifer. But as the climate dried, those same channels began to accumulate dry silt, dust, and the encroaching sand carried by the prevailing northern and western winds. This environmental shift required a corresponding adaptation in the daily operations of the people who tended the site. The maintenance crews who had once focused on clearing mud and directing water flow had to develop new techniques for managing sand accumulation. Sand, when driven by persistent desert winds, acts as a natural abrasive, scouring the lower courses of the stone and filling the excavated ditch with heavy, shifting dunes that can bury a monument in the span of a few decades if left unmanaged. The physical effort required to keep the enclosure clear of sand without the aid of mechanized equipment was immense, requiring organized labor forces equipped with wooden scrapers, woven baskets, and stone-carrying sledges. The changing climate also altered the vegetation and wildlife patterns around the plateau, shifting the economic foundation of the communities that supported the monument's maintenance. The large game animals, the elephants, giraffes, and wild cattle, that had grazed the open grasslands of the African humid period, migrated southward with the retreating rains. The lion populations, which had provided the living models for the great stone sculpture, became increasingly rare in the northern reaches of the river valley, eventually retreating into the deep desert wadis and the southern savannas. The monument remained as a stone record of an ecosystem that was vanishing from the daily experience of the people who inhabited the Giza region. The wind coming across the plateau carries a dry, sharp edge that tastes of mineral dust, rather than the heavy moisture of the old days. He stands at the western rim of the enclosure ditch, leaning against the polished wooden shaft of his clearing shovel, watching the fine grains of pale sand spill over the limestone lip and drift down into the trench below. The sky above him is pale and cloudless, bleached by a sun that burns with a steady, unrelenting heat even in the morning hours. He knows every contour of the stone below him, not from carving it, but from the endless, patient labour of keeping it uncovered. His grandfather had told him stories of a time when the great ditch ran with water during the winter months, when the channels at the base of the walls carried streams down to the lower basin. Now those channels are dry, packed with fine desert sand that must be scooped out basket by basket after every major windstorm. If the work stops even for a season, the sand piles against the flanks of the stone lion, climbing the legs, covering the haunches, burying the great paws until only the back and the head remain visible above the yellow floor of the plateau. He climbs down the rough wooden ladder that rests against the enclosure wall, his bare feet gripping the rungs with practiced ease. The air inside the ditch is still and hot, insulated from the breeze above but baking under the trapped heat of the sun. Along the base of the vertical limestone wall, the deep rounded grooves carved by the ancient rains rise above him like the folds of a heavy stone curtain. He runs his palm across the ridges between the channels. The stone is dry and slightly gritty, shedding fine grains of white lime under his touch. The tools of his trade are arranged neatly on a flat ledge of rock near the front paws. Broad wooden shovels carved from tough acacia wood, stiff brushes made from bundled palm fibres, and dozens of heavy baskets woven from river reeds. His crew is already at work along the southern flank, the rhythmic scratching of wooden blades against limestone echoing off the enclosure walls. They work in pairs, one scraping the accumulated sand from the lower ledge into a basket, the other hoisting the heavy load onto a wooden carrying pole to be hauled up the ramp and dumped outside the enclosure perimeter. The work is monotonous but essential. The master of the temple records has explained that the great lion must remain clear so that its eyes can meet the horizon without obstruction on the morning of the equinox. The alignment is a sacred trust, passed down from the ancestors who first freed the shape from the living rock. If the sand is allowed to blind the monument, the connection between the earth and the celestial clockwork will be broken, and the order of the seasons will fail. He stops near the chest of the monument, where a deep natural fissure in the bedrock has been filled with ancient mortar. He inspects the seam carefully, checking for any signs that the dry heat is causing the binding material to crack or pull away from the limestone. The mortar is old, harder than the surrounding stone, mixed with crushed lime and river sand by stoneworkers whose names have been lost to time. It holds firm, sealing the internal mass of the rock against the dry air and the intrusive sand. Satisfied, he He picks up his shovel and joins the line of workers along the southern wall. The sand is heavy today, packed tight by the night wind, but the rhythm of the crew is steady. They move together, breathing in time with the lift and swing of the baskets, preserving the ancient shape of the lion against the endless silent tide of the desert. The geological response of the Macadam Formation limestone to this transition from a wet, leaching environment to an arid, baking climate was a critical factor in the preservation of the monument's physical evidence. Limestone is a chemically active rock, composed primarily of calcium carbonate, which reacts sensitively to changes in moisture and temperature. During the thousands of years of heavy rainfall, the outer surface of the Sphinx and its enclosure walls was subjected to continuous chemical dissolution and mechanical carving by running water. This process left behind the deep vertical channels and undulating profiles that characterized the lower courses of the stone. When the rain ceased and the hyper-arid desert regime established itself, the weathering mechanism inverted. Instead of water washing minerals away from the stone, the intense solar heating of the plateau caused deep, subsurface moisture to be drawn toward the exterior surfaces of the limestone through capillary action. As this mineral-laden water reached the surface and evaporated in the dry desert air, it left behind dissolved calcium carbonate and other salts. Over centuries of intense sun exposure, this process created a hardened outer crust, a phenomenon known to geologists as case hardening or desert patina. This calcrete crust acted as a protective mineral armor across the weathered surfaces of the limestone. It locked the ancient vertical water erosion channels in place, sealing the delicate undulating profiles beneath a dense weather-resistant layer of recrystallized calcite. This case hardening explains why the deep precipitation weathering patterns survived through millennia of subsequent desert exposure. Without this natural mineral capping, the abrasive action of wind-blown sand would have gradually planed down the ridges and softened the vertical channels until the distinctive water erosion signature was completely obliterated. The accumulation of sand within the enclosure ditch also played a paradoxical role in preserving the monument's geological history. While the sand was a constant obstacle for the ancient maintenance crews, whenever the site was abandoned and the ditch filled completely, the deep sand blanket acted as a physical buffer against wind erosion. The lower two-thirds of the Sphinx body and the lowest courses of the enclosure walls spent much of their history buried beneath several meters of stable sand dunes. This burial insulated the ancient water-weathered stone from the scouring action of the desert winds, preserving the earliest erosion profiles in near-pristine condition, while the exposed head and upper back absorbed the brunt of the arid weathering. Understanding the diagenetic history of the Giza limestone, the complex sequence of wet dissolution, followed by arid, case-hardening and protective sand burial, clarifies how a monument carved 10,000 years ago could retain clear evidence of its origins through 5 millennia of desert history. The stone itself acted as a recording medium, capturing the signature of the wet climate in its deep channels, and then sealing that record beneath a hardened desert patina when the environment changed. The morning sun has barely cleared the eastern ridge, but the heat in the bottom of the trench is already heavy, trapped between the towering walls of bedrock and the massive stone flanks of the lion. He stands at the base of the rear haunch, holding a bronze plumb line against the weathered face of the limestone, his eyes tracking the vertical drop of the weighted cord across the deep undulations of the stone. He is a master stonecutter of the royal works, commissioned by the palace to assess the great monument before the new casing blocks are ordered from the quarries at Tura. The structure before him is unlike anything his crews have built for the reigning pharaoh. The temples and tombs rising on the plateau above are constructed from clean, rectangular blocks of cut stone, fitted together with precise joints and smooth vertical faces. But this monument is a single, continuous mountain of living rock, shaped by carvers who worked with the natural bedding planes of the plateau rather than imposing a geometric grid upon them, and it is ancient. The stone beneath his hand is deeply scarred, worn into hollows and rounded ridges that speak of an immense span of time before the royal house established its seat at Memphis. He runs his fingers along the base of the wall, where the bedrock core has deteriorated into soft, crumbly coves beneath the harder upper strata. His task is not to recarve the ancient lion, but to save it from collapse. The deep erosion channels carved by the ancient rains have weakened the lower courses of the stone, creating overhangs that threaten the stability of the massive torso above. To preserve the monument, His stoneworkers must encase the damaged bedrock core in a protective skin of massive limestone repair blocks, dressing the outer surface to restore the clean, powerful lines of the lion's body. A junior scribe stands beside him, holding a wooden pallet and a roll of smooth papyrus waiting for the measurements. The master stonecutter calls out the dimensions in royal cubits and palms, his voice echoing in the narrow space between the monument and the enclosure wall. He details the size of the limestone blocks required for the lower haunches, stones 4 cubits in length and 2 in height, cut from the finest white limestone of the eastern hills, shaped to fit exactly into the irregular weathered recesses of the ancient bedrock. He moves forward along the flank, examining the area where the front leg meets the chest. Here, the ancient carvers encountered a hard, nodular layer of limestone that resisted the smooth finishing seen on the upper body. The stonecutter notes how the early builders used a dense reddish mortar to fill the natural cavities in the rock before dressing the surface. He orders his scribe to record the need for fresh mortar of the same composition, mixed with lime and crushed pottery, to bed the new casing stones against the ancient core. He steps back to evaluate the head, shading his eyes against the rising sun. The face looks out across the valley, calm and remote, wearing the carved headdress of the royal line. He knows that the head is sound, carved from a harder, denser layer of the macadam stone that has resisted the deep channeling seen on the body below. But the neck is vulnerable, undercut by natural bedding seams that require careful shoring with fitted stone wedges before the heavy casing work begins below. The work will take years, requiring the labour of hundreds of skilled masons, quarrymen and transport crews, but as he looks down the length of the great enclosure, he understands the necessity of the effort. This monument is the guardian of the sacred precinct, the silent witness to the dawn that legitimizes the entire architectural program of the plateau. By encasing its weathered body in fresh, enduring stone, the royal house is not just repairing an old sculpture, it is binding its own dynasty to the deep ancestral authority of the rock. The physical evidence preserved across the Giza Plateau presents a complex, multi-layered record of human engineering and environmental change. From the deep vertical water erosion channels on the enclosure walls to the massive structural repair blocks added during the Old Kingdom, from the precise astronomical alignment with the precessional age of Leo to the internal electromagnetic anomalies detected within the bedrock core, each piece of data contributes to a narrative that extends far beyond the conventional 4.5 millennium timeline. The monument stands as a physical bridge between 2 distinct worlds, the fertile, rain-swept landscape of the early Holocene wet period and the highly organized, monumental civilization of dynastic Egypt. We do not yet know the exact names of the architects who first visualized the lion within the limestone ridge, nor do we know the complete inventory of what lies concealed within the rectangular chambers, detected deep within the body of the carving. What remains certain is that the Sphinx of Giza is a far more ancient and complex achievement than historical records alone suggest, an enduring monument to the capacity of early human cultures to observe the mechanics of the heavens and record their understanding in the permanent medium of the earth itself. You have been listening to a detailed examination of the unexplained evidence surrounding the antiquity of the Sphinx. This investigation has explored the geological, astronomical and physical records preserved at Giza to understand the true origins of this ancient structure. If you value this steady, rigorous approach to the mysteries of our ancient world, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment sharing your perspective on the evidence presented tonight. The night is quiet over the plateau now, the great stone lion keeping its eternal watch beneath the turning stars as the earth moves steadily toward another dawn.